In the cold, sterile confines of the Temple of Correction on Macragge, Roboute Guilliman's body had lain in stasis for 10 millennia, frozen at the moment of his mortal wounding by the traitor Primarch Fulgrim. The poison of the demon blade that had pierced his neck had been halted but never purged, leaving the Primarch of the Ultramarines suspended between life and death. The Armor of Fate, a masterwork of ancient technology, preserved what little remained of Guilliman's life force, its systems maintaining the impossible, a demigod neither alive nor truly dead. Belisarius Cawl, Archmagos Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus, had devoted centuries to understanding and improving upon the armor of Fate's intricate workings. Cawl was no ordinary tech priest. His knowledge spanned millennia, his consciousness having survived through arcane technological means that pushed the boundaries of what the Mechanicus considered acceptable. His hunched form, augmented beyond recognition as human, had become a vessel for technological innovation unmatched in the Imperium. The Armor of Fate represented the pinnacle of life, preserving technology from the era of the Horus Heresy. Its systems included molecular-level stasis fields, biometric regulators, and psycho-conductive interfaces that maintained a connection between Guilliman's physical form and his suspended consciousness. Cawl had modified these systems extensively, incorporating forbidden archaeotech and xenotech principles while careful to maintain the appearance of machine cult orthodoxy. Within the temple, Cawl had established a laboratory of staggering complexity. Cogitator arrays processed unfathomable quantities of data on Guilliman's condition. Medici servitors maintained a constant vigil, while tech priests performed the rituals necessary to appease the armor's machine spirit. The technological marvel that kept the Primarch in stasis was as much a religious artifact as it was a scientific achievement, blurring the line between technology and miracle that characterized the Imperium's relationship with its past. Yet for all Cawl's genius, the Primarch remained trapped between worlds. The Archmagos had reached the limits of Imperial science. Something more was needed, something beyond the understanding of the Mechanicus and perhaps beyond the Emperor's own designs. That catalyst came in the most unlikely form, the Eldari, ancient enemies of mankind. Specifically, the intervention came through Ivrain, the emissary of Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead. Her arrival on Macragge in the closing days of the 41st millennium marked a pivotal moment in Imperial history. Tall and lithe, with pale skin and eyes that reflected the infinite depths of death itself, Ivrain commanded the Inari, a faction of Eldari dedicated to their nascent death god. The alliance between Ivrain and the Imperium was not born of friendship or shared ideals, but of pragmatic necessity. The Inari sought to fully awaken their god Ennead, believing this would provide salvation for their dying race. Their prophecies indicated that the galaxy's coming trials would require Guilliman's return. For the Eldari, the Primarch represented a bulwark against the encroaching darkness of chaos, a darkness that threatened all life, not just humanity. The meeting between Cawl and Ivrain in the Temple of Correction was tense. Imperial and Mechanicus forces surrounded the Eldari delegation, fingers hovering near triggers. The Inari, for their part, maintained a deadly grace, their own weapons within easy reach. Trust between these ancient enemies was thin, sustained only by the gravest necessity. Ivrain brought with her the power of Ennead and the arcane knowledge of death that came with it. Where Imperial science had reached its limits, Eldari mysticism offered new possibilities. The ritual she performed was complex, drawing upon the energies of the nascent death god to navigate the boundaries between life and death where Guilliman's spirit was trapped. The power Ivrain channeled was the Crone Sword Vilithzar, an ancient Eldari artifact of immense psychic potential. As she placed it upon Guilliman's armored chest, energies flowed between the alien weapon and the Primarch's form. What followed was neither purely technological nor entirely mystical. It was a synthesis of Cawl's technological preparations and Ivrain's otherworldly powers. The moment of Guilliman's awakening shook the Temple of Correction to its foundations. A psychic shockwave rippled outward, felt by psychers across the sector. The Primarch's eyes opened, blue and cold as the void between stars, taking in a galaxy utterly transformed from the one he had known. Guilliman's first moments of consciousness were marked by disorientation and then rage. His last memory had been of betrayal, of Fulgrim's poisoned blade piercing his throat. Now he awoke to find his father's Imperium transformed into a grotesque caricature of its former self, a realm of superstition, ignorance, and decay. The Emperor, once a beacon of reason and progress, was now worshipped as a god. The secular imperial truth had been replaced by the dogmatic imperial creed. The Primarch's return immediately attracted the attention of the forces of chaos. The Black Legion, led by Abaddon the Despoiler, launched an assault on Macragge, determined to snuff out the rekindled hope that Guilliman represented. The battle for Macragge became the first test of the reborn Primarch's tactical genius in this new age. Despite 10 millennia of technological and cultural stagnation, Guilliman adapted quickly, his transhuman mind processing and responding to new tactical realities with frightening efficiency. With Macragge secured, Guilliman turned his attention to a greater journey, the Terran Crusade. The Primarch knew he must reach Terra, must see with his own eyes what remained of his father and the empire they had built together. The path to Terra, however, would prove far more perilous than even the Primarch anticipated. The Terran Crusade assembled a vast fleet of Imperial vessels, including elements of the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, White Scars, and numerous other chapters. Navigators plotted a course through increasingly turbulent warp space, as the Great Rift, a massive warp storm splitting the galaxy, was beginning to form, though none yet understood its full implications. The journey through the warp became a nightmare of impossible proportions. Kairos Fateweaver, greater demon of Tzinj, had foreseen Guilliman's awakening and prepared elaborate traps. The Imperial fleet found itself becalmed in the warp, assailed by demonic entities and reality-warping phenomena that defied comprehension. The Crusade fought through ambushes by the Red Corsairs, renegade Space Marines led by the traitor Huron Blackheart. These battles tested Guilliman's ability to counter the evolved tactics of chaos forces that had developed over the millennia of his absence. The Primarch demonstrated his legendary adaptability, quickly mastering the nuances of void warfare in the 41st millennium, despite the technological regression that had occurred since the Great Crusade. The nadir of the Terran Crusade came when Kairos Fateweaver successfully trapped Guilliman and his forces in the Maelstrom, a massive warp storm second only to the Eye of Terror. Here in the twisted realm of the Red Corsairs, Guilliman found himself captured through demonic trickery and bound in chains of impossible material, molecules of hope and despair woven together by the Changer of Ways. Salvation came from another unexpected quarter, the fallen angel Cypher and his mysterious allies. Their motives remained obscure, but their intervention proved decisive. Cypher freed Guilliman from his demonic bonds, extracting only a promise that the Primarch would grant him audience with the Emperor upon reaching Terra. The final leg of the journey to Terra required passage through the Webway, the ancient network of dimensional corridors created by the Old Ones and maintained by the Eldari. This impossible path became viable through the continued assistance of the Inari, who guided the Imperial forces through sections of the Webway still stable enough for passage. The emergence of Guilliman's forces on Luna, Terra's satellite, marked the Primarch's return to the heart of the Imperium he had helped build 10 millennia earlier. The journey from Luna to the Imperial Palace was a procession of awe and reverence, as billions of Terran citizens glimpsed their returned demigod. Many fell to their knees in religious ecstasy, much to Guilliman's discomfort. The Imperial Palace that Guilliman entered bore little resemblance to the magnificent seat of government he remembered. 10,000 years of architectural accretion, religious iconography, and fortress expansion had transformed it into a sprawling, labyrinthine complex that covered much of the Himalayan mountains. What had once been corridors of rational governance were now cathedral spaces thick with incense and echoing with prayer. The audience with the Emperor was a moment shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Only Guilliman himself knows what truly transpired when he knelt before the Golden Throne. The Primarch emerged from the Emperor's presence changed, his features set in grim determination. Whatever communion occurred between father and son remains known only to them, though rumors abound that the Emperor spoke directly to Guilliman's mind, that visions of the past and future were shared, that the Emperor's psychic might have grown rather than diminished over the millennia of his entombment. Following this audience, Guilliman moved with decisive purpose. He claimed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, a position he had held during the darkest days of the Horus Heresy. The High Lords of Terra, the committee of bureaucrats and faction leaders who had ruled in the Emperor's name for 10 millennia, found themselves superseded by one with the authority of the Emperor's own gene-crafted son. Guilliman's first acts as Lord Commander demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of the Imperium's dire situation. He ordered strategic assessments of all Imperial territories, requisitioned resources for immediate military campaigns, and began the process of modernizing Imperial command structures. The Primarch quickly identified the systemic failures that had led to the Imperium's stagnation, the bureaucratic bloat, the technological regression, the religious superstition that hampered scientific progress. Most significantly, Guilliman revealed the fruits of Belisarius Cahl's secret labors, the Primaris Space Marines. These enhanced Astartes represented the next evolution of the Emperor's finest warriors, developed from the Primarch's own genetic template, but improved upon through Cahl's 10 millennia of research and experimentation. Taller, stronger, and equipped with newly developed weaponry and armor, the Primaris Marines would form the spearhead of Guilliman's plans to reclaim the Imperium. As Guilliman assumed command, astropathic choirs across the galaxy reported unprecedented warp disturbances. The Great Rift was forming, a galaxy-spanning tear in reality that would soon divide the Imperium in two. Worlds were swallowed by warp storms, while others reported demonic incursions on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy. The awakened Primarch stood at the precipice of a new age of darkness. The Imperium he had helped build lay fractured and besieged. Yet for the first time in 10 millennia, humanity possessed something it had long lost, the strategic genius of a Primarch and the hope his presence inspired. As the storm clouds gathered, Guilliman prepared to launch the greatest Imperial campaign since the Great Crusade itself, the Indomitus Crusade. The galaxy burned. As Roboute Guilliman marshaled his forces on Terra, an apocalyptic event was already unfolding that would forever alter the face of the Imperium. The seeds of this catastrophe had been sown long before the Primarch's awakening, in the ice-wreathed fortress world of Cadia. Cadia stood as the linchpin of the Imperium's defenses against the Eye of Terror for millennia. Its strategic position at the only stable route from this massive warp storm made it the cornerstone of the Cadian Gate, a heavily fortified region that had withstood 12 Black Crusades, led by Abaddon the Despoiler. The planet's population bred natural warriors, their distinctive purple eyes a genetic quirk that had become synonymous with their military prowess. Cadia stands was not merely a motto, but a defiant statement of fact that had held true for 10,000 years. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade changed everything. Unlike previous assaults, this campaign was the culmination of millennia of planning. The Despoiler, once first captain of the Luna Wolves and now Warmaster of Chaos, had learned from each previous failure. His forces struck not just at Cadia, but at countless systems simultaneously, stretching Imperial defenses beyond their breaking point. Massive battleships, including the Planet Killer and the Blackstone fortresses, brought unprecedented firepower to bear against Imperial positions. The defense of Cadia was led by Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, a tactical genius whose name had become legendary across the Imperium. Under his command, the Cadian shock troops and elements from over 30 Space Marine chapters fought with desperate valor. For a brief moment, it seemed the impossible might happen again, that Cadia might stand against even this overwhelming assault, but Abaddon had planned for every contingency. When conventional warfare failed to break the planet, he resorted to the unthinkable. The remains of a Blackstone fortress, crippled in orbit, were sent plummeting toward Cadia's surface. The impact shattered the planet's structural integrity, breaking apart the world that had defied the forces of chaos for 10 millennia. The destruction of Cadia released a chain reaction through the warp, as ancient pylons that had long suppressed the Eye of Terror's influence were destroyed. The death of Cadia triggered a catastrophic expansion of warp energy. Warp storms that had been building for centuries suddenly erupted across the galaxy in a demonic tidal wave. Like a wound torn across reality itself, the Cicatrix Maledictum, known more commonly as the Great Rift, split the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe. This immense tear in reality manifested as a physical phenomenon visible even to those without psychic ability, a purple-red gash across the night sky, pulsing with malevolent energies. The immediate aftermath of the Great Rift's formation was a period of unprecedented horror known as the Noctis Aeterna, the Long Night. For weeks or even months, depending on a world's location relative to the rift, the light of the Astronomicon was completely extinguished. This psychic beacon, powered by the Emperor's will and the sacrifice of thousands of psykers daily, had guided Imperial ships through the warp for 10 millennia. Its absence left countless vessels stranded in the Imperium, easy prey for the denizens of that hellish dimension. On thousands of worlds, the Noctis Aeterna brought immediate calamity. Psykers, whose minds were attuned to the warp, experienced the most direct effects. Many simply exploded in gory displays as warp energy overwhelmed their mental barriers. Others became gateways for demonic entities to pour into real space. Even non-psykers felt the effects. Waves of dread, nightmares, and mass hysteria swept through populations as the barrier between real space and the warp thinned to near non-existence. The practical effects of the Great Rift were equally devastating. The Imperium, which had survived for 10 millennia through its ability to coordinate vast distances, found itself literally split in two. The region on the Terran side of the rift became known as Imperium Sanctus, the Imperium of Light, still illuminated by the Astronomicon once it flickered back to life. The far side, cut off from Terra's influence, became Imperium Nihilus, the Imperium of Darkness, also grimly referred to as the Dark Imperium. Imperium Nihilus encompassed approximately half of humanity's domains, including critical regions such as the realm of Ultramar, the Fenris system, and Baal. These regions found themselves effectively isolated, with warp travel between them and Terra becoming nearly impossible or suicidally dangerous. The few ships that managed to cross the Great Rift reported journeys that should have taken weeks stretching into years, with most vessels never returning at all. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the organization responsible for interstellar communication through astropathic messages, found their capabilities severely compromised. Astropaths attempting to send messages across the rift often died in the attempt, their minds shredded by the chaotic energies they encountered. Those messages that did get through arrived garbled beyond recognition or took years to reach their destinations. In many cases, the information they contained was obsolete by the time it arrived. Within Imperium Nihilus, the breakdown of communication and transportation created a domino effect of systemic collapse. Forge worlds, unable to receive raw materials, ceased production of vital equipment. Agri-worlds, cut off from the protection of Imperial forces, fell to Xenos raiders or starvation as their own harvests failed due to warp-spawned blights. Hive worlds, dependent on interstellar trade for basic necessities, descended into anarchy as food supplies dwindled. The administrative structure of the Imperium proved inadequate to address a crisis of this magnitude. The Adeptus Administratum, already notorious for its Byzantine bureaucracy, found itself paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. Reports that did reach Terra often contradicted each other, creating a picture of the Imperium's status that was fragmentary at best and wildly inaccurate at worst. In this desperate situation, many Imperial worlds found themselves forced into self-reliance for the first time in millennia. Planetary governors who had previously served as little more than tax collectors suddenly became the highest authority their populations recognized. Some rose to the challenge admirably, implementing emergency measures that preserved their worlds through the crisis. Others succumbed to despair, madness, or the temptations of chaos, further accelerating their planet's decline. The Great Rift's effects extended beyond human territories. Across the galaxy, Xeno civilizations found themselves equally affected by the cataclysm. The Eldari, with their superior understanding of the warp, had foreseen aspects of this catastrophe, which partly explained Ivrain's intervention in Guilliman's awakening. Their craftworlds implemented ancient protective measures, wrapping themselves in layers of psychic shielding that partially mitigated the worst effects. The Necrons, whose technology operated on principles antithetical to the warp, found their tomb worlds largely protected from direct warp incursion, but still vulnerable to the secondary effects as nearby human worlds collapsed into anarchy. Many Necron dynasties accelerated their awakening protocols in response, seeing opportunity in the Imperium's disarray. The Orcs, characteristically, thrived in the chaos. Wags. that might have been contained by Imperial forces in normal circumstances exploded across multiple sectors. The psychic nature of Orc society meant that many warbosses experienced visions they interpreted as divine mandates from their gods Gork and Mork, leading to unprecedented levels of Orc unity and aggression. The Tyranid Hive fleets, driven by biological imperatives rather than warp-influenced motivations, continued their inexorable advance into the galaxy. However, the disruption of the warp created new patterns in their approach, as Hive fleets altered course to avoid regions of intense warp activity that could damage their synaptic networks. Within the Imperium, the most immediate threat came from the forces of chaos, which poured through the Great Rift in unprecedented numbers. Demon worlds, planets fully subsumed by the warp, formed within previously Imperial space, creating strongholds from which further incursions could be launched. Entire populations were sacrificed in mass rituals that further weakened the barrier between real space and the immaterium. The traitor legions, who had nursed their hatred of the Imperium for 10 millennia within the Eye of Terror, found themselves suddenly able to strike at targets that had previously been beyond their reach. The Death Guard brought plagues of impossible virulence to formerly untouched worlds. The Thousand Suns used the warp disruptions to enhance their sorcerous powers to unprecedented levels. The Word-Bearers established cults on thousands of worlds, converting desperate populations to the worship of the Dark Gods. Even more concerning were the countless renegade Space Marine chapters that turned to chaos in the wake of the catastrophe. The strain of defending hopeless positions, cut off from support, and with no prospect of reinforcement, proved too much for many Astartes. Some turned to the Dark Gods out of desperation, seeking the power to protect the populations they had sworn to defend, only to become the very threat they had fought against. The Inquisition, tasked with defending the Imperium from internal threats, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of heresy unleashed by the Great Rift. Inquisitors operating in Imperium Nihilus were forced to make impossible choices, sometimes condemning entire worlds to exterminatus rather than risk the spread of chaos corruption. Those in Imperium Sanctus implemented increasingly draconian measures, as paranoia about warp-tainted refugees from across the rift led to purges of potentially innocent populations. The Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's finest warriors, found themselves stretched beyond even their transhuman capabilities. Many chapters were reduced to a fraction of their former strength, fighting desperate last stands on critical worlds. Others were forced to abandon their traditional territories entirely, retreating to defensible positions from which they launched guerrilla campaigns against overwhelming enemy forces. It was into this maelstrom of galactic calamity that Roboute Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade. The returning Primarch recognized that the Imperium faced extinction if decisive action was not taken immediately. The Primaris Space Marines, revealed to an astonished Imperium, would form the spearhead of this effort. These enhanced Astartes represented Belisarius Caul's century-spanning project to improve upon the Emperor's original design, creating warriors better equipped to face the horrors of the 41st millennium. The scale of devastation wrought by the Great Rift demanded a response of equal magnitude. Guilliman's strategic genius, combined with his authority as the Emperor's son, allowed him to marshal resources on a scale unseen since the Great Crusade. Forge worlds that had operated at partial capacity for millennia were ordered to full production. The Adeptus Mechanicus, recognizing the existential threat, set aside many of their normal restrictions to implement Guilliman's directives. The Primarch's first priority was stabilizing Imperium Sanctus, securing the territory on Terra's side of the Great Rift to establish a solid foundation from which to attempt the reconquest of Imperium Nihilus. This required not just military action, but administrative reform on an unprecedented scale. Guilliman's experience as both a warrior and a statesman proved invaluable as he reorganized imperial command structures to respond more effectively to the crisis. Deep beneath the red sands of Mars, in sealed vaults that had remained untouched for 10 millennia, Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Caul had labored on a project of staggering ambition. While the Imperium above had descended into technological regression and religious dogma, Caul's hidden forges hummed with activity that would have been deemed tech heresy by many of his peers. The ancient Archmagos had been working on nothing less than the improvement of the Emperor's greatest creation, the Adeptus Astartes. This secret project began in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when Roboute Guilliman, foreseeing his possible incapacitation, charged Call with a monumental task. The Primarch provided the Archmagos with samples of genetic material from the original Space Marine legions, entrusting him to develop a new generation of transhuman warriors who could face the evolving threats to mankind. For 10,000 years, through the Age of Apostasy, the War of the Beast, and countless other calamities, Call continued his work in absolute secrecy. The laboratories where this work took place represented the pinnacle of Imperial technology. Vast gene vaults contained samples preserved in stasis fields, their genetic codes maintained with perfect fidelity across the millennia. Biomantic chambers housed prototype subjects in various stages of development, their metabolic processes slowed to near suspension to allow for long-term observation. Cogitator arrays of unimaginable complexity ran simulations of genetic interactions, predicting outcomes with machine precision that approached prescience. Call himself had changed dramatically over the centuries of his work. His original human form had been gradually replaced with mechanical components until only fragments of biological tissue remained. His consciousness expanded across multiple data cores, allowing him to simultaneously oversee thousands of experiments. The Archmagos had become a hybrid entity, part human, part machine, and wholly dedicated to his appointed task. The breakthrough in Call's work came from his understanding of the Emperor's original gene crafting techniques. Where others saw the Astartes as the perfect warriors, Call recognized them as incomplete. The Emperor had been forced to rush the later stages of Space Marine development during the pressures of the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade. Call's unhurried centuries allowed him to perfect what the Emperor had been forced to compromise. The result was the Primaris Space Marine, taller, stronger, and more resilient than their predecessors. Standing approximately half a head taller than traditional Astartes, the Primaris Marines possessed more stable gene seed and 3 additional implanted organs that dramatically enhanced their combat capabilities. The first of these new organs was the sinew coils, also known as the Belisarian furnace. These interwoven bundles of artificially grown muscle fibers were implanted alongside the existing musculature of the Primaris Marine, providing enormous increases in strength and durability. Unlike normal muscle tissue, sinew coils did not fatigue with use, allowing Primaris Marines to maintain peak physical performance for extended periods. In moments of extreme stress or injury, the Belisarian furnace could activate, releasing a surge of hormones and artificial stimulants that allowed the Primaris Marine to fight on despite wounds that would incapacitate even a traditional Astartes. The second organ, the Magnificat, enhanced the effects of the existing Biscopia implant. Where the original organ stimulated muscle growth, the Magnificat amplified this process exponentially, while simultaneously strengthening bone structure and connective tissue. This prevented the common failure point of many biological systems, where increased muscle strength would damage the skeleton or tendons supporting it. The Magnificat ensured that a Primaris Marine's entire physical structure developed in harmony, creating warriors whose every biological system was enhanced beyond normal Astartes capabilities. The third and perhaps most significant addition was the Belisarius furnace, an implant that integrated with the Primaris Marine's existing Susan membrane and Laramens organ. This complex organ monitored the Astartes' physiological state constantly. When catastrophic damage was detected, the furnace would trigger an extreme regenerative response, flooding the body with artificial stem cells, coagulants, and regenerative compounds. Primaris Marines with activated furnaces could recover from injuries that would kill their traditional counterparts, sometimes regaining consciousness and combat effectiveness in the midst of battle despite having suffered mortal wounds moments before. These biological enhancements required equally advanced armor systems to reach their full potential. The Mark X Tacticus Power Armor represented a complete redesign of Astartes' battle plate, incorporating technologies and materials that had been lost to most of the Imperium for millennia. The armor's ceramic plates were molecularly aligned for maximum impact resistance while maintaining optimal weight distribution. Internal power distribution systems were more efficient than previous marks, allowing for enhanced strength amplification without increased bulk. The Mark X was designed with unprecedented modularity, allowing for specialized variants to be easily produced without complete redesigns. The most common of these variants was the Gravis pattern, which incorporated additional ablative plating and enhanced power systems for close-quarters assault operations. Gravis armor turned Primaris Marines into mobile fortresses, able to withstand concentrated heavy weapons fire while closing with enemy positions. For covert operations, the Phobos variant stripped away excess armor in favor of enhanced sensor suites and sound dampening systems. Primaris Marines in Phobos armor could move with a silence that seemed impossible for warriors of their size, their footfalls muffled by kinetic dispersal pads, and their thermal signatures masked by heat bleed systems integrated throughout the armor. The Omnis pattern represented the pinnacle of Mark X development, combining elements of both Gravis and Phobos variants, while adding specialized systems unique to each individual warrior's role. Limited in number due to the resources required for its creation, Omnis armor was typically reserved for Primaris officers and specialists whose battlefield roles demanded maximum adaptability. The armament of the Primaris Marines was equally revolutionary. The bolt rifle, standard issue for Primaris infantry, represented a significant improvement over the traditional bolter. Its extended barrel and enhanced propellant system provided greater range and accuracy, while modified bolt shells delivered increased penetrating power. The auto bolt rifle variant sacrificed some of this precision for a dramatically increased rate of fire, making it ideal for suppression tactics and close-quarters engagements. Heavy bolt rifles, issued to Primaris heavy support specialists, incorporated barrel cooling systems and stabilization gyros that allowed for sustained fire without loss of accuracy. The plasma incinerator, a refinement of traditional plasma weapon technology, reduced the risk of catastrophic overheating while increasing power output, making it a favored special weapon among Primaris squads facing heavily armored opposition. Perhaps most impressive was the bolt pistol's larger cousin, the heavy bolt pistol. Despite its compact size, it delivered firepower comparable to a standard bolter, allowing Primaris officers and assault specialists to maintain significant ranged capability even in close combat situations. The organizational structure of Primaris forces reflected both innovation and tradition. Guilliman, ever the strategist, recognized that simply replacing existing Astartes formations would waste the unique capabilities of both traditional and Primaris Marines. Instead, he developed new tactical doctrines that integrated both warrior types, leveraging their complementary strengths. The core of Primaris organization centered around the Intercessor Squad, the equivalent of tactical Marines in traditional chapters. Equipped with bolt rifles and trained in adaptable combat doctrines, Intercessors formed the backbone of Primaris deployments. Their enhanced durability and superior ranged firepower made them ideal for holding ground and providing covering fire for more specialized units. Aggressor squads represented the Primaris answer to Terminator armor. Clad in Gravis plate and armed with Flamestorm gauntlets or Boltstorm gauntlets paired with Fragstorm grenade launchers, aggressors delivered devastating short-range firepower. Their tactical flexibility came from their ability to advance and fire without penalty or to remain stationary and double their already impressive rate of fire. For reconnaissance and surgical strikes, Vanguard units filled a niche previously occupied by Scout Marines, though with significantly enhanced capabilities. Infiltrators utilized advanced stealth technology, including Omni-Scramblers that disrupted enemy communications and Helix Adepts, who provided battlefield medical support. Their counterparts, the Incursors, specialized in forward deployment and enemy fortification reduction, equipped with Oculus bolt carbines that ignored cover bonuses and haywire mines that could disable enemy vehicles. The integration of these new forces into existing chapter structures presented significant challenges. Many chapter masters viewed the Primaris Marines with suspicion, seeing them as potential usurpers rather than reinforcements. The Adeptus Mechanicus, despite Call's status, questioned the technological innovations that seemed to skirt the edges of their doctrinal restrictions. Even among the general imperial population, the appearance of these enhanced warriors raised questions about the Emperor's original design and whether tampering with it represented progress or heresy. Guilliman addressed these concerns with characteristic pragmatism. Rather than replacing existing Astartes, Primaris Marines were presented as reinforcements, desperately needed in the wake of the Great Rift. Depleted chapters received Primaris companies that operated alongside traditional Marines, demonstrating their loyalty through shared combat. Over time, as trust developed, integration proceeded at varying rates depending on each chapter's culture and needs. Some chapters embraced the Primaris Marines immediately. The Ultramarines, following their Primarch's example, incorporated Primaris warriors into their ranks with minimal friction. The Salamanders, always practical in their approach to warfare, recognized the tactical advantages offered by these new warriors. Others, like the Space Wolves and Black Templars, maintained a degree of separation, allowing Primaris Marines to prove themselves through deeds before full acceptance. The creation of entirely new chapters composed solely of Primaris Marines avoided many of these integration issues. The Rift Stalkers, Dawn Breakers, and Sons of the Phoenix were among dozens of new chapters formed in the early days of the Indomitus Crusade. These chapters, lacking established traditions and rivalries, could be deployed to critical war zones without concerns about cultural conflicts or chain of command disputes. Despite their advantages, Primaris Marines were not without limitations. The complexity of their implants and equipment made field repairs more difficult, particularly in Imperium Nihilus, where supply lines were tenuous at best. Their specialized weapons, while powerful, required unique ammunition types that could not be easily substituted with standard Astartes equipment. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact of their creation, grown in artificial wombs rather than recruited from human populations, created a disconnect from the cultures they were meant to defend. Call had anticipated some of these issues. The Primaris creation process included hypno-indoctrination specific to each chapter's culture, implanting artificial memories and behavioral patterns that mimicked those of traditionally recruited Astartes. Combat simulations during their development included scenarios drawn from their assigned chapter's history, creating shared reference points with their traditional brothers. Even physical characteristics were modified to match the general appearance of their destination chapter, reducing visible differences beyond their increased stature. The battlefield impact of Primaris Marines became apparent during the earliest engagements of the Indomitus Crusade. At the Siege of Gathalammer, a single company of Primaris Ultramarines broke a word-bearer's assault that had pinned down 3 companies of traditional Astartes. On Rin's world, Primaris Crimson Fists demonstrated their worth by reclaiming fortifications that had been deemed unassailable by conventional forces. The liberation of Baal saw Primaris Blood Angels fighting with the same controlled fury as their brothers, dispelling concerns about their susceptibility to the chapter's genetic flaws. In the sprawling war chambers of the Imperial Palace, Roboute Guilliman stood before hololithic displays that mapped the broken Imperium. The ancient stratagem, untouched since the days of the Horus Heresy, had been reactivated to serve as the nerve center for what would become the greatest military undertaking since the Emperor's Great Crusade. Servitors moved silently through the shadows, maintaining cogitators that processed data from thousands of worlds, while tech priests monitored fluctuating warp conditions across what remained of Imperium Sanctus. Guilliman's planning was methodical and comprehensive. For weeks after his audience with the Emperor, the Primarch sequestered himself with ancient tactical treatises, studying the millennia of imperial history he had missed. He absorbed centuries of military doctrine, analyzed countless campaigns, and identified patterns of imperial decline that had gone unnoticed by the High Lords of Terra. The Primarch's transhuman mind processed this information with remarkable speed, synthesizing a strategic overview that few others could comprehend in its totality. The logistical challenges facing the Crusade were unprecedented. The Great Rift had severed supply chains, disrupted astropathic communications, and rendered traditional campaign planning nearly impossible. Guilliman addressed these obstacles by establishing a multi-tiered command structure that could operate with considerable autonomy. Fleet groups would be assigned broad strategic objectives rather than specific tactical directives, allowing them to adapt to changing conditions without constant communication with Terra. The composition of the Crusade's forces reflected Guilliman's understanding that this would not be a short campaign. The Primarch organized his available resources into distinct battle groups, each tailored for specific operational requirements. These ranged from rapid strike forces designed to hit vulnerable enemy positions to massive siege fleets capable of breaking the most heavily fortified Chaos strongholds. At the heart of these preparations stood the Primaris Space Marines. The first 100,000 of these enhanced warriors had been awakened from their stasis chambers beneath Mars, their training completed through hypno-indoctrination during their artificial development. They moved with purpose through the mustering grounds of Terra and Mars, their new Mark 10 armor gleaming under the artificial lights of vast assembly halls. Each warrior bore the heraldry of their assigned chapter, though many still moved with the slight awkwardness of those unaccustomed to their enhanced physical capabilities. The integration of these new forces with existing Imperial military structures required careful management. Guilliman personally oversaw the assignment of Primaris contingents to depleted chapters, ensuring that each received reinforcements appropriate to their combat doctrine and immediate tactical needs. For chapters that viewed the Primaris with suspicion, the Primarch arranged joint operations that would build trust through shared combat experience. Beyond the Adeptus Astartes, Guilliman secured the commitment of other essential Imperial organizations. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributed not just war materiel, but combat forces as well. Skitare legions, their augmented bodies housing weapons that blended ancient technology with modern innovation, formed the backbone of the Mechanicus contribution. Towering battle automata of the Legio Cybernetica marched alongside them, their machine spirits awakened for the first time in centuries for this critical campaign. The tech priests of Mars viewed the Indomitus Crusade with complex emotions. Many saw it as an opportunity to recover lost technologies from worlds cut off by the Great Rift. Others recognized the existential threat that chaos represented to their forge worlds. Archmagos Call's influence ensured that conservative elements within the Mechanicus hierarchy did not obstruct the provision of resources, though many remained privately concerned about the technological innovations he had incorporated into the Primaris project. From the Adeptus Custodes came a contribution unprecedented since the Great Crusade. The Emperor's personal guardians, who had rarely left Terra in 10 millennia, committed significant forces to Guilliman's endeavor. 500 of these Golden Warriors, each the equal of a dozen Space Marines, would accompany the Crusade fleets. Their presence represented not just immense martial prowess, but also symbolic significance, demonstrating the Emperor's tacit approval of Guilliman's plans. The custodians brought with them relics and weapons not seen since the Horus Heresy. Ancient Contemptor Galatus dreadnoughts, their occupants veterans of battles fought alongside the Emperor himself, awakened from their slumber in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace. Alaris Terminators, their Ormite armor impervious to all but the most powerful weapons, prepared teleport Homer beacons that would allow them to materialize directly into the heart of enemy formations. Virtus Praetors performed maintenance rituals on their Dawn Eagle jet bikes, weapons platforms that combined speed and firepower in equal measure. Accompanying the custodians were detachments from the Silent Sisterhood. These Null Maidens, their mere presence capable of disrupting warp energies, would prove invaluable against the demonic entities pouring through the Great Rift. Organized into Vigilator and Prosecutor cadres, the Sisters brought with them expertise in combating warp-tainted foes that even the Astartes lacked. Their witch-seeking abilities would prove crucial in identifying chaos infiltrators on liberated worlds. The Sisters of Silence operated from specialized vessels, equipped with null field generators that created bubbles of psychic emptiness around them. These ships would serve as mobile fortresses from which the Null Maidens could deploy rapidly to counter psychic threats. Their presence in the Crusade fleet represented another link to the Imperium's past, a restoration of the Emperor's original vision for humanity's defense against the warp. Imperial Navy assets assigned to the Crusade included vessels drawn from Battle Fleet Solar and other less depleted naval formations. Ancient battleships that had been held in reserve for millennia were recommissioned, their weapon systems updated under Call's supervision. The flagship of the Crusade, Guilliman's own Macrag's Honor, had been retrofitted with technologies recovered from Dark Age vaults, its capabilities enhanced beyond any other vessel in the Imperial Armada. The naval officers commanding these ships represented the finest void masters in the Imperium. Many had been personally selected by Guilliman after reviewing their service records, with preference given to those who had demonstrated adaptability and initiative, qualities that would be essential in the unpredictable conditions created by the Great Rift. These captains underwent intensive briefings on the Primarch's tactical doctrines, learning command protocols that had not been implemented since the Great Crusade. Astra Militarum regiments were assigned to the Crusade in unprecedented numbers. Cadian survivors, their homeworld destroyed but their martial tradition unbroken, formed the core of these forces. They were supplemented by regiments from Catachan, Vestroia, Mordian, and dozens of other worlds with proud military histories. These human soldiers would secure and garrison worlds after the Astartes spearhead had moved on, establishing defensive perimeters that would prevent Chaos forces from reclaiming liberated territory. The Militarum contingents brought with them vast quantities of armor and artillery. Leman Russ battle tanks and Basilisk self-propelled guns were produced in numbers not seen since the Macharian Crusade, their manufacturing expedited by Martian forged temples operating at maximum capacity. Super heavy vehicles including Baneblades and Shadow Swords were allocated to specialized armored regiments, their firepower capable of breaking enemy formations that even Astartes might struggle to engage directly. As these forces gathered, Guilliman finalized his strategic blueprint, the Codex Imperialis. This document represented the culmination of the Primarch's analysis of the Imperium's current state and his vision for its restoration. Unlike his earlier Codex Astartes, which focused primarily on Astartes' organization and tactics, the Codex Imperialis addressed the full spectrum of Imperial military operations in the age of the Great Rift. The Codex Imperialis detailed new approaches to void warfare that accounted for the unpredictable nature of warp travel in the aftermath of the Great Rift. It established protocols for maintaining supply lines through regions of space where the Astronomican's light flickered unreliably. Most importantly, it outlined a comprehensive strategic framework for reclaiming the Imperium piece by piece, identifying key worlds and systems whose liberation would create stable zones from which further operations could be launched. Guilliman's adaptation of classical military doctrine to the 41st millennium demonstrated his genius for strategic innovation. The Primarch recognized that many principles from the Great Crusade era remained valid, but required modification to address new threats. The Codex Imperialis incorporated lessons from 10,000 years of imperial warfare, synthesizing them with Guilliman's own tactical insights to create a comprehensive approach to warfare in the age of the Great Rift. The document placed particular emphasis on counter-chaos operations, drawing on the Primarch's experiences during the Horus Heresy. It detailed methods for identifying and neutralizing chaos cult activity on liberated worlds, established quarantine protocols for regions exposed to warp contamination, and outlined exorcism procedures developed in conjunction with the Ordo Malleus for cleansing demon-tainted structures and artifacts. On the eve of the Crusade's launch, Guilliman addressed his assembled commanders in the Great Stratagem of the Imperial Palace. The chamber, designed to accommodate the Emperor and his Primarchs during the planning of the Great Crusade, had not seen such a gathering in 10 millennia. Chapter Masters and Lord Admirals stood alongside Mechanicus Magi and Astra Militarum generals, their traditional rivalries temporarily set aside in the face of unprecedented crisis. With the strategic framework secured and the Imperium's forces gathered, the Indomitus Crusade was launched from Terra in the fateful year of 999 of the 41st millennium, mere months after Guilliman's return. The timing was deliberate, Astrological alignments had created a temporary stabilization in warp conditions around the solar system, providing a narrow window for the massive fleet to depart safely. Navigators had spent weeks in meditation, communing with the Astronomicon to plot the most secure routes through the increasingly treacherous Imperium. The initial push from Terra focused on securing the solar segmentum, the region of space surrounding Holy Terra itself. This area had suffered relatively less from the effects of the Great Rift than more distant regions, but still contained numerous worlds that had fallen to chaos incursions or rebellions triggered by the Noctis Eterna. Securing these planets was both strategically necessary and symbolically important, demonstrating the Imperium's ability to protect its heartland. The first major engagement of the Crusade came at the Gathalammer system, where Word-Bearer's forces had established a foothold during the confusion following the Great Rift's formation. The Chaos Space Marines had converted much of the population to the worship of the Dark Gods, using them as sacrificial offerings to maintain warp storms that isolated the system from Imperial reinforcement. Guilliman's approach to Gathalammer demonstrated his tactical flexibility. Rather than a direct assault on the main inhabited world, the Primarch ordered a series of precision strikes against outlying facilities that the Word-Bearers were using as ritual sites. Vanguard infiltrator squads deployed via drop pod identified these locations, allowing Custodian Virtus Praetors to conduct decapitation raids that eliminated key Chaos leaders before they could respond. With the warp storms weakened by the disruption of sustaining rituals, the main Crusade fleet translated into the system. Word-Bearers vessels that moved to intercept found themselves outmaneuvered by Imperial Navy ships operating under new void warfare protocols established in the Codex Imperialis. Guilliman personally led the ground assault on Gathalammer Prime, his presence inspiring Imperial forces to feats of valor that overwhelmed the Chaos defenses despite their entrenched positions. The liberation of Gathalammer established a template that would be replicated across the solar segmentum. Precision intelligence gathering, followed by targeted strikes to disrupt enemy command structures, preceding main force engagement. This approach minimized Imperial casualties while maximizing operational tempo. Within 6 months, 12 major systems had been reclaimed, creating a secure perimeter around Terra that hadn't existed since before the Great Rift's formation. As the Crusade pushed outward from this secure core, it encountered increasingly determined resistance. On Ophelia 7, a cardinal world of significant religious importance, Alpha Legion operatives had instigated a civil war that had reduced once magnificent cathedral cities to rubble. The labyrinthine urban terrain favored the defenders, who had prepared ambush positions and booby traps throughout the ruins. Here, Guilliman deployed Primaris Inceptor squads for the first time in major combat operations. These assault troops, equipped with jump packs that allowed for rapid repositioning, bypassed prepared defenses to strike at enemy command nodes. Their assault bolters swept clear building complexes that would have required days of room-to-room fighting to secure conventionally. Supporting aggressor squads provided overwhelming firepower that collapsed enemy strongpoints, while Reaver units conducted psychological warfare operations that demoralized civilian populations that had been pressed into service by the Alpha Legion. The success at Ophelia 7 demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms operations as outlined in the Codex Imperialis. Traditional Astartes, Primaris Marines, Astra Militarum armor, and Mechanicus support units operated in concert, each element compensating for the other's vulnerabilities. This integrated approach became the hallmark of Indomitus Crusade operations, allowing Imperial forces to overcome enemies that might have proved insurmountable to any single component operating alone. The Indomitus Crusade pushed deeper into Segmentum Solar with methodical precision, each engagement building upon the lessons of the last. Guilliman's forces advanced along multiple vectors simultaneously, preventing Chaos forces from concentrating their defenses at any single point. This multi-pronged strategy allowed the Crusade to reclaim dozens of worlds in rapid succession, establishing secure corridors through which supply lines could be maintained and reinforcements channeled. The Gehenna system became an early focal point of the Crusade's efforts in Segmentum Solar. Once a prosperous center of imperial industry, Gehenna's 5 inhabited worlds had fallen to a massive Death Guard incursion during the chaotic days following the Great Rift's formation. Mortarian's sons had transformed these once productive planets into festering plague worlds, their populations either slaughtered or converted into shambling hosts for newly engineered contagions. The atmospheric conditions on Gehenna Prime presented unique challenges for Imperial forces. Thick clouds of necrotic spores hung in the air, capable of corroding ceramite and infecting even Astartes' physiology. Standard Imperial Guard forces would have been completely ineffective in such conditions, requiring sealed life support systems simply to survive the toxic environment. Even traditional Space Marines found their armor's filtration systems taxed to their limits by the virulent pathogens engineered by the Death Guard's biologous putrefiers. Here, the advantages of the Primaris Marines became starkly apparent. Their enhanced physiology and superior armor systems allowed them to operate in conditions that would have rapidly incapacitated other Imperial forces. Primaris Hellblasters of the Nova Marines chapter spearheaded the assault on Gehenna Prime, their plasma incinerators burning away swathes of plague, infected terrain with cleansing fire. Behind them came Inceptor squads from the Aurora chapter, using their mobility to outflank entrenched Death Guard positions. The Death Guard responded with typical implacable resilience. Plague Marines emerged from fortifications constructed from the fused corpses of the planet's former inhabitants, their bloated forms absorbing punishing amounts of firepower without faltering. Fetid bloat drones hovered above the battlefield, spraying flesh-melting chemicals that could reduce ceramite armor to bubbling sludge in seconds. Plagueburst crawlers launched salvos of mortar fire containing alchemical compounds that triggered spontaneous mutation in anything they touched. The turning point came when Guilliman committed elements of the Silent Sisterhood to the Gehenna campaign. The Null Maiden's presence disrupted the psychic energies, sustaining many of the Death Guard's more esoteric plagues. Prosecutor squads advanced alongside Primaris intercessors, their null auras creating zones where Nurgle's influence waned temporarily. In these areas, even conventional weapons proved effective against the plague-ridden traitors, allowing Imperial forces to establish footholds on the planet's surface. The liberation of Gehenna took nearly 3 months of grueling combat. Even after the Death Guard forces had been driven off-world, the planets themselves remained uninhabitable, their environment so thoroughly corrupted that even the most optimistic Adeptus Mechanicus assessments suggested centuries would pass before they could be safely colonized again. Nevertheless, the strategic victory was significant. A major Chaos stronghold had been neutralized, and valuable intelligence about Death Guard tactics and capabilities had been gathered. As the Crusade expanded outward from Segmentum Solar into Segmentum Pacificus, it encountered resistance of a different nature. Where the forces of Nurgle had relied on attrition and biological warfare, the Crusade now faced the lightning raids and deceptive strategies of the Alpha Legion. These traitors had spent the millennia since the Horus Heresy perfecting the arts of infiltration and asymmetric warfare, and the confusion following the Great Rift had provided them with unprecedented opportunities to establish hidden power bases throughout the Segmentum. The Valoria system exemplified the challenges posed by such enemies. On the surface, the system's primary worlds appeared to have weathered the Noctis Eterna relatively well. Planetary governors maintained order, tithes continued to flow, and defense forces stood ready to repel obvious threats. It was only when a routine inspection by Adeptus Administratum officials revealed statistical anomalies in production reports that deeper investigation was triggered. What the Crusade forces discovered was a sophisticated network of Alpha Legion operatives who had quietly assumed control of key positions throughout the system's governance structure. These infiltrators had been in place for decades before the Great Rift, patiently accumulating influence and positioning assets. When the Astronomicon failed during the Noctis Eterna, they activated sleeper agents and quickly seized control of vital infrastructure, all while maintaining the appearance of Imperial rule. Conventional military approaches proved ineffective against this shadow takeover. Guilliman responded by deploying specialized units trained in counter-infiltration operations. Vanguard eliminators from the Raven Guard used their advanced targeting systems to identify and neutralize Alpha Legion commanders hiding among civilian populations. Reaver squads conducted night raids on suspected traitor safe houses, capturing intelligence assets that revealed further layers of the conspiracy. The most effective tools in this campaign, however, were the Primaris incursors. These close support troops combined stealth capabilities with formidable combat prowess, allowing them to match the Alpha Legion at their own game. Using Oculus bolt carbines with optical targeting systems that could penetrate camouflage and disguise, incursors systematically eliminated Alpha Legion cells throughout the Valorian hive cities. The campaign culminated in the assault on Valoria Prime's central administrative spire, where the Alpha Legion had established their command center. Rather than a frontal assault that would have resulted in massive civilian casualties, Guilliman authorized a precision strike utilizing Vanguard infiltrators. These specialists used their multi-spectrum sensor arrays to identify hidden explosives and traps throughout the structure, allowing following forces to neutralize them before they could be triggered. The liberation of Valoria demonstrated Guilliman's adaptability as a commander. Recognizing that different threats required different approaches, the Primarch had tailored his forces and tactics to the specific nature of the enemy faced. This flexibility would prove crucial as the Crusade pushed further into the galactic west, encountering increasingly diverse opposition. As the Indomitus Crusade expanded its operations across Segmentum Pacificus, the strategic importance of reclaiming the region's forge worlds became increasingly apparent. These manufacturing centers represented irreplaceable industrial capacity that would be essential for sustaining the broader imperial reconquest. Many had fallen not to direct chaos assault, but to internal strife, as rival Mechanicus factions fought for control of rare technologies and production facilities during the confusion of the Noctis Eterna. The Forge world of Connor exemplified both the challenges and opportunities presented by such worlds. Once a major producer of Astra Militarum vehicles and heavy ordnance, Connor had descended into factional conflict when its ruling fabricator general was assassinated in the early days of the Great Rift's formation. 3 rival archmagos claimed succession rights, each controlling different manufacturing districts and commanding the loyalty of different Skidari legions. Rather than simply imposing imperial authority through military might, Guilliman approached the Connor situation with diplomatic finesse. The Primarch dispatched Belisarius Call as his personal envoy, knowing that the ancient archmagos commanded respect even among the most traditional elements of the Mechanicus hierarchy. Call arrived with a modest escort of Primaris Techmarine advisors and a data cache of STC fragments recovered during earlier Crusade operations. These technological offerings proved persuasive. 2 of the rival archmagos agreed to reconciliation talks, recognizing that cooperation offered better prospects for technological advancement than continued conflict. The third faction, which had begun incorporating clearly heretical modifications into their Skidari forces, refused all overtures and declared themselves loyal only to the true machine god, a clear indication of dark Mechanicum influence. The resulting campaign to secure Connor became a model for Forge world reclamation throughout the Segmentum. Loyal Mechanicus forces, supported by Primaris Marines from the Iron Hands and their successor chapters, systematically isolated and eliminated the corrupted faction. Particular care was taken to preserve manufacturing facilities and data vaults, with Call personally overseeing the purging of corrupted machine spirits from critical systems. Within 2 months, Connor's production capabilities had been largely restored, with assembly lines producing much-needed Rhino transports and Chimera personnel carriers for Crusade forces. More importantly, the Forge world became a staging area for further operations in the region, its orbital shipyards refitting damaged vessels, and its manufactoria producing ammunition and replacement parts for frontline units. The strategic pattern established at Connor was replicated across a dozen Forge worlds in Segmentum Pacificus. Each reclaimed manufacturing center exponentially increased the Crusade's logistical capabilities, creating a snowball effect that accelerated the pace of Imperial reconquest. By the midpoint of the Indomitus Crusade, production capacity in the segmentum had reached 60% of pre-rift levels, a remarkable achievement given the scale of destruction initially wrought. As the Crusade pushed toward the borders of Segmentum Obscurus, it encountered increasingly determined resistance from Chaos forces. The traders recognized that allowing Guilliman to establish a secure power base in Segmentum Pacificus would position Imperial forces to threaten the Eye of Terror itself. In response, they committed significant resources to stopping the Crusade's advance, culminating in the massive confrontation that would become known as the Battle of Rocos. The Rocos system had once been a minor Imperial naval way station, its significance limited to its position along stable warp routes connecting Segmentum Pacificus to Obscurus. When the Great Rift formed, these warp routes became among the few reliable passages between the segmenta, instantly transforming Rocos into a location of immense strategic importance. Chaos forces, led by elements of the Black Legion, seized control of the system during the Noctis Aeterna, establishing fortifications throughout the asteroid belt known locally as the Pit of Rocos. From this position, the forces of the Despoiler could threaten Imperial supply lines and launch raids against reclaimed worlds. Guilliman recognized that securing Rocos was essential for the Crusade's continued momentum. The Primarch gathered a massive force for the operation, including elements from over 30 Space Marine chapters, Battlefleet Gothic detachments, and Mechanicus Titan legions. This concentration of military might represented the largest single deployment of the Indomitus Crusade to that point. The Battle of Rocos began with a series of probing attacks by Vanguard Reaver squads, who used grav chutes to infiltrate the asteroid field and gather intelligence on enemy dispositions. These reconnaissance operations revealed that the Chaos forces had transformed the larger asteroids into interconnected fortress monasteries, each bristling with defense lasers and lance batteries. Between these fixed positions patrolled hundreds of smaller craft, from converted mining vessels to dedicated Chaos frigates. Guilliman's battle plan demonstrated his genius for three-dimensional warfare. Rather than a direct assault on the main Chaos strongholds, the Primarch ordered a series of synchronized strikes against the system's outer navigation beacons. Space Marine strike cruisers translated into real space at precisely calculated points, deploying boarding torpedoes containing Terminator and Aggressor squads before withdrawing. These elite forces secured the beacons and reprogrammed them to broadcast false navigational data. The next phase saw Adeptus Mechanicus forces under Call's command deploy a network of gravitic disruptors at key points throughout the outer system. These devices, based on recovered Dark Age technology, created localized distortions in the asteroid belt's orbital patterns. Minor perturbations cascaded into major orbital shifts, forcing Chaos vessels to constantly adjust their patrol patterns and creating gaps in their coverage. With the enemy's defensive network compromised, Guilliman launched the main assault. Imperial Navy battleships engaged Chaos fleet elements in the outer system, while Astartes strike forces targeted the fortress asteroids. Primaris Inceptor squads led these assaults, their jump packs allowing them to traverse the vacuum between asteroids without need for vessels that could be targeted by defensive fire. The fighting within the asteroid fortresses was brutal and close-quartered. Chaos Space Marines, many bearing the marks of 10 millennia in the Eye of Terror, defended their positions with fanatical determination. Demon engines stalked the cramped corridors of converted mining facilities, their mechanical components fused with warp entities that defied conventional physics. Cultist slaves were driven forward in human wave attacks, their numbers so great that in some passages they simply choked the corridors with their dead, creating barricades of corpses that had to be burned away with promethium flames. The decisive moment came when Guilliman himself, accompanied by an honor guard of Victrix Guard, teleported directly into the command center of the largest fortress asteroid. The Primarch's arrival caught the Chaos leadership unprepared, as they had believed their location shielded by warp-based obfuscation rituals. The combat that followed was swift and decisive. Guilliman's mastery of bladework with the Emperor's sword left a trail of bisected Chaos champions in his wake, while the Victrix Guard methodically eliminated the command staff. With their leadership decapitated and communications disrupted, Chaos resistance throughout the Pit of Rokos began to fragment. Individual fortress asteroids continued fighting, but without coordination, they were isolated and eliminated one by one. Within 3 weeks, Imperial forces had secured the entire asteroid field, establishing their own fortifications to ensure the system would remain in Imperial hands. The strategic implications of the victory at Rokos extended far beyond the system itself. With this crucial waypoint secured, Imperial forces could move freely between Segmentum Pacificus and the southern regions of Obscurus. Supply lines to the Crusade's forward elements were shortened by weeks, allowing for more rapid reinforcement and resupply. Perhaps most importantly, the defeat represented the first major setback for Chaos forces attempting to contain the Indomitus Crusade. The reclamation of the Rokos system marked a turning point in the Indomitus Crusade. With this strategic waypoint secured, Guilliman could now assess the broader impact of his campaign on the Imperium Sanctus. Reports from across reclaimed territories indicated that while much had been accomplished, the strain on existing Space Marine chapters had been severe. Many had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength, with some counting fewer than 100 battle brothers still in active service. Aboard the Macrag's Honor, Guilliman reviewed casualty reports with his command staff. The toll was sobering. The Nova Marines had lost over 60% of their fighting strength, retaking the Gehenna system. The Crimson Fists remained at barely half capacity despite Primaris reinforcements, and even the Ultramarines had suffered losses that would take decades to replace through traditional recruitment methods. The time has come. Guilliman's message to Belisarius Call was characteristically direct, to implement the final phase of the Primaris project. The Archmagos had anticipated this directive. Deep within the Tsar Quisitor, Call's massive Arc Mechanicus, thousands of stasis chambers hummed with energy as their systems began the revival sequence. Unlike the initial Primaris Marines deployed at the Crusade's outset, these warriors had been created with specific destinations in mind. Each bore genetic markers that aligned them with existing chapters, their implanted memories tailored to include the traditions and battle honors of their intended brotherhoods. The process of reinforcing existing Space Marine chapters with Primaris battle brothers was complex, both logistically and culturally. Guilliman established a standardized protocol that began with formal presentation of the Primaris Marines to the chapter's command structure. The ritual typically involved the Primaris warriors kneeling before the chapter master, swearing oaths of loyalty to both their new brotherhood and the Primarch who had created them. For chapters like the Ultramarines and their successors, this integration proceeded smoothly. These sons of Guilliman's gene line recognized the Primarch's authority and accepted his creation of the Primaris as an extension of their own genetic heritage. When Primaris reinforcements reached Macrag, Chapter Master Marnius Calgar received them in the Fortress of Hera with full honors, publicly embracing them as true sons of Guilliman despite his private reservations about their impact on his own authority. Other chapters approached the integration with greater caution. When Primaris reinforcements arrived at the Fang, the fortress monastery of the Space Wolves, they found themselves held at arm's length by their prospective brothers. The Wolves, fiercely protective of their unique culture and traditions, subjected the newcomers to a series of trials designed to test not just their combat prowess, but their understanding of Space Wolf sagas and customs. Only after proving themselves in both battle and feast hall were these Primaris warriors accepted as true sons of Rus. The Black Templars presented a different challenge entirely. This perpetually crusading chapter, known for its religious zeal and devotion to the Emperor, questioned whether Primaris Marines shared their faith with appropriate fervor. Chaplain Grimaldus personally interrogated the Primaris reinforcements, testing their knowledge of the Imperial Creed and their willingness to undertake the chapter's traditional vows. The process concluded with a ritual scarification ceremony, where each Primaris Marine received the distinctive cross-shaped scar that marked them as a true Black Templar. For chapters with more secretive or esoteric practices, the integration process included additional steps. The Blood Angels and their successors required extensive testing to determine whether Primaris Marines carried the genetic flaws of their gene line, the Red Thirst and Black Rage. Initial results proved encouraging, with Primaris Blood Angels displaying greater resistance to these afflictions than their traditional counterparts. This discovery led some among the chapter to hope that Call's modifications might eventually provide a permanent solution to the curse that had haunted them since the days of Sanguinius. The Dark Angels approached the Primaris reinforcements with characteristic suspicion. The Inner Circle, those privy to the chapter's darkest secrets regarding the fallen, subjected Primaris candidates to mind scrubbing procedures before allowing them access to the rock. Even then, most Primaris Dark Angels found themselves restricted to the Green Wing, excluded from the specialized companies and the secrets they protected. Only gradually, as individual Primaris warriors proved their loyalty through exceptional service, did the barriers begin to lower. While the reinforcement of existing chapters formed one aspect of the Ultima founding, the creation of entirely new Primaris chapters represented an even more ambitious undertaking. Guilliman authorized the founding of hundreds of new chapters, each composed entirely of Primaris Marines without the cultural baggage or established traditions of existing formations. These new chapters would form the backbone of the Imperium's defense in regions most devastated by the Great Rift, establishing fortress monasteries on critical worlds to ensure Imperial control. The gene seed selection for these new chapters revealed much about Guilliman's strategic thinking. While all 9 loyalist Primarchs were represented, the distribution was not equal. Ultramarine successors formed the largest contingent, their gene seed considered the most stable, and their doctrinal approach aligning with Guilliman's own tactical preferences. Imperial Fist and Blood Angel successors were also created in significant numbers, their specialties in defensive warfare and shock assault filling crucial tactical niches. More surprising was Guilliman's authorization of new chapters based on gene lines with known instabilities. Several new chapters received Dark Angel's gene seed despite the secretive nature of the First Legion's successors. Even the Space Wolves, whose genetic material had previously resisted efforts to create successful successor chapters, found their gene line represented in the Ultima founding through chapters like the Wolf Spear. The naming and heraldry of these new chapters often reflected their intended purpose or theater of operations. The Void Tridents, created from Ultramarine stock, received extensive void warfare training before deployment to the Charedon sector, where their expertise would be crucial in combating Orc naval forces. The Dawn Breakers, bearing Blood Angel's gene seed, were specifically equipped and trained for operations in the perpetual darkness of worlds caught in the shadow of the Great Rift. Some new chapters bore names and heraldry that created controversy among established Space Marines. The Sons of the Phoenix, despite their name and gold and purple color scheme suggesting ties to the Emperor's children, were officially listed as Imperial Fist successors. The Tome Keeper's obsession with preserving knowledge echoed the pre-heresy word-bearers, though they carried Ultramarines' gene seed. Whether these similarities represented deliberate choices by Guilliman or Call's independent decisions remained unclear. The cultural development of these new chapters took varied paths. Some, like the Rift Stalkers, developed distinct identities based on their operational environments, adopting the traditions and beliefs of the populations they protected. Others maintained a more direct connection to their progenitor chapters, consciously modeling their organizational structures and combat doctrines on established templates while incorporating innovations made possible by their Primaris physiology. The logistical challenge of equipping these new chapters was immense. Each required not just weapons and armor, but all the specialized equipment and vehicles necessary for independent operations. Forge Worlds recently liberated by the Crusade shifted production priorities to meet these needs, manufacturing everything from bolt rifles to repulsor grav tanks. The ancient Forge World of Metallica alone supplied equipment for over 30 new chapters, its manufactoria operating at capacity levels not seen since the Great Crusade. Beyond equipment, these new chapters required headquarters from which to operate. On some worlds, ancient fortress monasteries abandoned during the Age of Apostasy were reconsecrated and recommissioned. Others saw the construction of entirely new facilities, often incorporating architectural elements that complemented the chapter's developing culture. The Fortress of the Star Wardens, built into the side of a mountain on Procellas, featured extensive astronomical observatories that allowed the chapter to monitor warp storm activity in their assigned sector. The deployment of these new chapters followed strategic patterns established in the Codex Imperialis. Guilliman placed many along the borders of the Great Rift, creating a defensive cordon against chaos incursions from this massive warp tier. Others were stationed at critical infrastructure nexuses, forge worlds, major trade hubs, and worlds with significant promethium reserves. Some received more specialized assignments, like the Umbral Knights, who were tasked with protecting a cluster of worlds whose populations displayed unusually high rates of psychic potential. While the creation of new chapters and reinforcement of existing ones proceeded, tensions inevitably developed between traditional Astartes and their Primaris counterparts. These frictions manifested differently across chapters, reflecting their varied cultures and histories. Among the Ultramarines, the conflict took a subtle form, expressed through competing interpretations of the Codex Astartes. Traditional Ultramarines pointed to their millennia of experience implementing Guilliman's teachings, while Primaris Marines countered that their enhanced capabilities required tactical adaptations that the Primarch himself would have approved. This intellectual debate occasionally spilled over into training cages, where traditional and Primaris Marines tested their respective approaches in practice bouts that sometimes exceeded normal safety parameters. For the Space Wolves, the tension centered on cultural authenticity. Traditional Sons of Rus questioned whether Primaris warriors, regardless of their battlefield prowess, could truly understand what it meant to be a wolf. The genetic modifications that made Primaris Marines resistant to the curse of the Wolfen also disconnected them from an aspect of the chapter's identity that traditional Space Wolves viewed as fundamental. Wolf priests worked to bridge this divide, developing modified rituals that allowed Primaris Marines to connect with the chapter's traditions while acknowledging their physiological differences. The White Scars faced similar challenges, with traditional warriors questioning whether Primaris Marines could truly embrace the chapter's lightning warfare doctrine without having risen from the nomadic tribes of Chagoris. Concorsaro addressed this concern directly, organizing mixed unit training exercises that forced traditional and Primaris Marines to coordinate their efforts. These exercises typically concluded with ritual feasts where traditional Astartes shared stories of Chagoris, while Primaris Marines offered fresh tactical insights gained from their enhanced perspective. Perhaps the most severe tensions emerged in chapters with secretive inner circles or hidden agendas. The Dark Angels' Primaris contingent found themselves subjected to constant scrutiny, excluded from operations involving the hunt for the fallen, and denied explanation for these exclusions. Similar dynamics played out among the Blood Ravens, whose traditional members continued to pursue their quest for knowledge about the chapter's mysterious origins, while keeping their Primaris brothers at a distance from these investigations. Guilliman monitored these tensions closely, recognizing that true integration would require time and shared combat experiences. He deliberately structured Crusade battle groups to include both traditional and Primaris elements from the same chapters, forcing them to work together against common enemies. The Forge of Battle proved effective in breaking down barriers, as warriors who had fought back-to-back against Chaos forces found it difficult to maintain suspicion of one another afterward. The Primarch also encouraged the cross-training of officers, assigning traditional Astartes sergeants to command Primaris squads and vice versa. These exchanges facilitated the transfer of knowledge in both directions, traditional Marines learning to leverage the enhanced capabilities of Primaris troops, while Primaris officers absorbed the tactical wisdom accumulated over millennia of warfare. The development of specialized Primaris chapters, created specifically for tactical niches, represented another dimension of the Ultima founding. Unlike broad-purpose chapters, these formations received extensive training and equipment tailored to specific operational environments or mission types. The Void Tridents exemplified this approach. Created from Ultramarines' gene stock, but heavily modified for Void operations, Every battle brother underwent extensive training in zero-gravity combat and shipboarding actions. Their Mark 10 armor featured additional maneuvering thrusters and magnetic clamping systems that allowed unprecedented mobility in vacuum environments. The chapter's fleet consisted primarily of smaller, faster vessels optimized for interdiction operations, complementing their specialization in boarding actions and hit-and-run attacks. The Sons of the Phoenix, despite controversy surrounding their potential genetic heritage, were developed as specialists in combating demonic entities. Their training included extensive study of warp phenomena and practical experience in containing and banishing lesser demons under controlled conditions. Chaplains from the Grey Knights provided guidance in developing mental fortitude against warp influence, while Ordo Malleus Inquisitors shared restricted knowledge of demonic weaknesses and banishment techniques. The chapter's Fortress Monastery on Primuli included specialized containment facilities where particularly dangerous warp artifacts could be studied and neutralized. The wolf spear bearing Space Wolves gene seed, but composed entirely of Primaris Marines, developed a unique operational doctrine that blended traditional Fenrisian pack tactics with the enhanced mobility provided by their Primaris physiology. Unlike the traditional Space Wolves, who often eschewed codex organization, the wolf spear adopted a modified company structure that incorporated elements of both Guilliman's teachings and Fenrisian pack dynamics. Their deployment to the Imperium Nihilus placed them far from Fenris, allowing them to develop their own cultural identity while maintaining spiritual connections to their progenitor chapter. The Dawn Breakers, successors to the Blood Angels, specialized in operations on worlds affected by perpetual darkness, whether due to natural conditions or the shadow of the Great Rift. Their enhanced auto senses were further modified to function optimally in low-light conditions, while their combat doctrine emphasized silent elimination of priority targets before main force engagement. The chapter developed close ties with the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose assistance was crucial in maintaining their specialized equipment, including modified land speeders equipped with advanced auspex, arrays capable of penetrating even the densest darkness. As these specialized chapters deployed to their assigned theaters, they quickly demonstrated the effectiveness of Guilliman's approach. The Void Tridents achieved a significant victory in the Charadan sector, intercepting and boarding an Orc rock before it could crash into the Forge world of Metallica. The Sons of the Phoenix successfully contained a major demonic incursion on Sanctus Macheria, banishing a greater demon of Tzeentch that had eluded Imperial forces for decades. Each success validated the concept of specialized Primaris formations and provided tactical data that could be incorporated into the training of other chapters. The Ultima founding represented more than just the creation of new Space Marine chapters. It signified Guilliman's vision for the Adeptus Astartes in the era of the Imperium divided. By reinforcing existing chapters while simultaneously establishing new ones, the Primarch ensured that humanity's defenders could respond to threats across both Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. The specialized capabilities of the Primaris Marines, combined with the accumulated wisdom of traditional Astartes, created a more adaptable and resilient force than had existed previously. As the Indomitus Crusade continued its advance, these newly founded and reinforced chapters formed its backbone. The Ultima founding had given the Imperium something it desperately needed in the face of unprecedented challenges: hope, embodied in transhuman warriors who stood ready to defend humanity regardless of the cost to themselves. Though tensions between traditional and Primaris Astartes remained, their shared purpose transcended these differences, forging bonds that would be tested in the fires of wars yet to come. As the Indomitus Crusade consolidated its gains across Imperium Sanctus, Guilliman's strategic focus began to shift toward the desperate situation unfolding in Imperium Nihilus. Reports filtering through the Great Rift painted a grim picture of Imperial worlds cut off from Terra's light, fighting desperate last stands against enemies emboldened by the Imperium's division. The Primarch recognized that without intervention, half of humanity's domain would be lost within decades. Fleet Primus represented Guilliman's answer to this existential crisis. Comprising over 500 warships drawn from Battle Fleet Solar, Mars, and various chapter fleets, this massive armada was assembled at the Pit of Rocos following its liberation. The fleet's composition reflected its challenging mission: heavily armed capital ships capable of operating independently for years without resupply, accompanied by faster escort vessels equipped for reconnaissance in hostile territory. At the heart of Fleet Primus sailed the Macrag's Honor, Guilliman's flagship and the mightiest vessel in the Ultramarines fleet. The ancient battle barge had been extensively refitted under Belisarius Call's supervision, incorporating technologies recovered from Dark Age vaults that had remained sealed since before the Horus Heresy. Its void shields now operated at efficiencies that defied conventional Mechanicus understanding, while its warp engines had been modified to better navigate the turbulent Imperium beyond the Great Rift. The command structure of Fleet Primus demonstrated Guilliman's political acumen. While overall strategic direction remained with the Primarch, day-to-day operations were entrusted to Lord Admiral Spire, a veteran Void Master whose tactical genius had been proven during the Gothic War centuries earlier. This appointment reassured the Imperial Navy that their prerogatives would be respected, while simultaneously freeing Guilliman to focus on broader strategic concerns. The Adeptus Custodes maintained a significant presence within Fleet Primus, with Shield Captain Heraclast Vadrian commanding a cadre of nearly 100 of the Emperor's personal guardians. These Golden Warriors served multiple purposes. They provided unmatched combat prowess when boarding actions or planetary assaults became necessary, but their symbolic importance was perhaps even greater. The presence of the Custodes demonstrated that despite the Great Rift's division of the Imperium, the Emperor's will still extended into the darkened regions of Imperium Nihilus. The journey to breach the Great Rift began with meticulous preparation. Navigators from the Navis Nobilites, most prestigious houses, spent weeks in meditation, communing with the fractured light of the Astronomicon as it filtered through the Great Rift. Their goal was to identify temporary passages, areas where the immense warp storm briefly thinned enough to allow transit. Such opportunities were unpredictable and fleeting, requiring precise timing and extraordinary navigational skill to exploit. The Nachmund Gauntlet emerged as the most promising route. This relatively stable passage through the Great Rift connected the Vigilus and Sangua systems, creating a narrow corridor through which Imperial forces could potentially reach Imperium Nihilus. Strategic prognostication by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica indicated that the gauntlet would remain navigable for at least several years, making it the logical focus for Fleet Primus's crossing attempt. The strategic significance of the Nachmund Gauntlet could hardly be overstated. As one of the few reliable passages through the Great Rift, it represented a lifeline between the two halves of the fractured Imperium. Control of this corridor would allow for the movement of troops, supplies, and information between Imperium Sanctus and Nihilus, a capability that could mean the difference between survival and extinction for countless Imperial worlds beyond the Rift. This importance was not lost on the Imperium's enemies. Even as Fleet Primus gathered at the Vigilus end of the gauntlet, intelligence reports indicated that Chaos forces were already moving to contest control of this vital passage. Warband fleets bearing the icons of the Black Legion had been sighted at the edges of the Nachmund system, while cultist uprisings on Vigilus itself suggested pre-invasion infiltration was already underway. The initial push through the Nachmund Gauntlet was preceded by reconnaissance missions conducted by specialized vessels. Blackstone fortresses, sleek, warp-capable craft crewed by Primaris Vanguard Marines, penetrated the fringes of the gauntlet, gathering data on enemy positions and warp conditions. These missions confirmed that while passage was possible, Fleet Primus would face opposition from the moment it entered the corridor. The transit itself began in 12M42, with navigator Primus Alana Vorschenk guiding the Macrag's Honor into the swirling energies of the gauntlet. The massive battleship's entry created a temporary wake in the warp, allowing smaller vessels to follow in its path. Even with this advantage, the crossing proved harrowing. Reality itself seemed to flex and distort around the Imperial ships, with some vessels reporting time dilation effects that caused minutes on the bridge to correspond to hours in the engine compartments. Chaos forces struck when Fleet Primus was at its most vulnerable, approximately halfway through the gauntlet, where the Astronomican's light was weakest. A battle group of Chaos cruisers, led by the Desolator-class battleship Merciless Death, translated into real space directly in the fleet's path. The ambush was well planned, with enemy vessels positioned to maximize crossfire opportunities against the stretched-out Imperial formation. The resulting Void battle demonstrated why Guilliman had insisted on such heavy naval escorts for the crossing. Imperial Navy cruisers moved to engage the Chaos vessels, creating a protective screen behind which the more valuable troop transports and supply ships could continue their advance. The battle lasted nearly 18 hours, with ships exchanging broadside fire at ranges so close that some vessels suffered damage from their own weapons' backwash. The tide turned when a strike force of Custodian Virtus Praetors launched from the Macrag's honor, using their Dawn Eagle jet bikes to cross the void between vessels. These elite warriors boarded the Merciless Death directly, bypassing its void shields through precision teleport insertions. Within 2 hours, they had fought their way to the battleship's bridge and eliminated its command staff, leaving the vessel adrift and leaderless. Without central coordination, the remaining Chaos vessels broke formation, allowing Imperial ships to pick them off individually. Despite this victory, Fleet Primus suffered significant losses during the crossing. Nearly 80 ships were lost to either enemy action or warp phenomena, including the venerable battle cruiser Dominion of Terra, which disappeared without trace during a period of intense warp turbulence. The human cost was equally severe, with thousands of crew members driven to madness by exposure to the raw energies of the rift, necessitating purges that further depleted the fleet's already strained personnel resources. The fleet that emerged into the Sangua system at the far end of the Nachmund gauntlet was battle-scarred but resolute. Guilliman immediately established a fortified beachhead on Sangua Terra, the system's primary world, deploying Primaris Marines to secure critical infrastructure and eliminate pockets of resistance. This world would serve as Fleet Primus's primary staging area for operations in Imperium Nihilus, a bastion of Imperial authority in a region where such authority had become increasingly abstract. From Sangua Terra, Guilliman dispatched smaller fleets to key systems throughout Imperium Nihilus. Each of these secondary expeditions carried not just military forces, but also the technological and administrative resources necessary to re-establish Imperial governance on worlds cut off from Terra. Most critically, they transported the gene seed, equipment, and personnel needed to reinforce Space Marine chapters isolated beyond the rift. The Blood Angels were among the first to receive such reinforcement. Their homeworld of Baal had endured a massive Tyrannid assault coinciding with the formation of the Great Rift, leaving the chapter severely depleted. A detachment from Fleet Primus reached the Baal system with a contingent of Primaris Blood Angels, genetic descendants of Sanguinius created from carefully preserved gene seed samples. Chapter Master Dante, though initially skeptical of these new warriors, recognized their arrival as the Emperor's providence, accepting them into the chapter's ranks as true sons of Sanguinius. Similar reinforcement missions reached other first founding chapters isolated in Imperium Nihilus. The Space Wolves received Primaris Battle Brothers on Fenris, where Logan Grimnar integrated them into the chapter's great companies after subjecting them to modified versions of traditional trials. The Dark Angels, operating from their mobile fortress monastery, the Rock, received their Primaris reinforcements with characteristic suspicion, keeping them segregated from the chapter's inner circles until they could be properly vetted. The delivery of Primaris technology to these ancient chapters represented more than simple reinforcement. It provided them with the means to create their own Primaris Marines from local recruits. Each expedition carried with it the specialized equipment and biological materials necessary for this process, along with tech Marines trained in its implementation. This approach addressed a critical vulnerability of chapters in Imperium Nihilus. Their isolation had cut them off from traditional sources of gene seed and equipment, threatening their long-term survival. The Custodes played a crucial role in these reinforcement missions. Shield Captain Vadrian personally led many of the most critical expeditions, his presence ensuring compliance from even the most tradition-bound chapter masters. The Custodes brought with them not just the Emperor's authority, but also specialized knowledge of the Primaris creation process, having observed its development on Mars under Call's direction. Their involvement helped overcome technical challenges that might otherwise have prevented successful implementation of the Primaris protocols. This initiative evolved into what became known as the Torchbearers, a formal organization comprising elements of the Adeptus Custodes, Sisters of Silence, and specialized Mechanicus personnel. The Torchbearers operated semi-autonomously throughout Imperium Nihilus, identifying Space Marine chapters in danger of extinction and providing them with the resources needed to rebuild their strength through Primaris reinforcement. The logistical challenges facing the Torchbearers were immense. Operating in regions where warp travel had become unpredictable at best, they required vessels capable of sustained, independent operation. Each Torchbearer task force typically included at least one Custodes cruiser, escorted by smaller craft equipped for both combat and supply transport. These vessels carried not just Primaris Marines and their equipment, but also the specialized biological materials and technical apparatus necessary for creating more such warriors. Supply lines to support these operations had to be established through some of the most dangerous territory in the galaxy. The Nachmund Gauntlet served as the primary artery, with heavily armed convoys making the perilous crossing on a regular schedule. Secondary routes utilized other, less stable passages through the Great Rift temporary corridors that might remain navigable for weeks or months before collapsing. Navigators capable of finding these passages became among the most valued personnel in Fleet Primus, their skills literally irreplaceable in the context of operations beyond the Rift. Beyond the Nachmund Gauntlet, other stable warp routes took on similar strategic importance. The Callium Gate, connecting the Stygius and Armageddon sectors, provided access to the galactic southeast of Imperium Nihilus. The Mojave Passage linked worlds near the Tau Empire to Imperial strongholds in the Ultima Segmentum. Each of these routes required constant monitoring and defense, as their loss would isolate entire sectors from what limited support Terra could provide. The defense of these crucial passages became a primary focus of Fleet Primus operations. Permanent battle stations were established at key points along each route, equipped with long-range auger arrays capable of detecting incoming threats. Space Marine strike cruisers maintained constant patrols, ready to respond to any incursion attempt. On nearby worlds, Astra Militarum regiments constructed extensive defensive positions, preparing for the ground assaults that would inevitably follow any successful naval penetration. Despite these precautions, maintaining control of the stable warp routes required constant vigilance and frequent combat. Chaos forces recognized the strategic value of these passages as clearly as their Imperial counterparts, launching repeated attempts to sever these lifelines. Orc raiders, drawn to the concentration of military assets, conducted opportunistic strikes against convoy vessels. Even Tyranid Hive fleets, operating according to their inscrutable biological imperatives, occasionally tested Imperial defenses along these corridors. The most significant challenge to Imperial control came at the Nachmund Gauntlet itself. Approximately 2 years after Fleet Primus's crossing, a massive Black Legion fleet under the command of Chaos Lord Urcanthos attempted to seize control of the Sangua end of the passage. The ensuing conflict, which would become known as the Battle of Sangua Gate, represented one of the largest void engagements of the post-Rift era. Imperial defenders, forewarned by Adeptus Mechanicus monitoring stations, had prepared a multi-layered defense. Orbital platforms equipped with Nova cannons and Lance batteries formed the outer perimeter, while Space Marine strike cruisers maintained mobile reserve positions, ready to reinforce threatened sectors. On Sangua Terra itself, Primaris Vanguard units prepared for the ground assault that would inevitably follow if void defenses failed. The Battle of Sangua Gate demonstrated the tenacity with which the Imperium would defend its precious few lifelines through the Great Rift. When Urcanthos' Black Legion fleet emerged from the warp, they encountered not just static defenses, but a carefully orchestrated Imperial response. Battle Group Alphas, commanded by Rear Admiral Carline, executed a pincer maneuver that caught the Chaos vessels between concentrated lance fire from orbital platforms and torpedo spreads from concealed Cobra-class destroyers. The Black Legion flagship, a desecrated Grand Cruiser named Harbinger of Despair, suffered catastrophic damage to its propulsion systems, leaving it vulnerable to repeated attack runs by Fury interceptors launched from the Imperial light carrier Emperor's Wrath. As the Void battle raged, Mortarian's Death Guard launched their own offensive in a different theater entirely. The Plague Wars of Ultramar had begun. The assault on the realm of Ultramar represented a calculated strike at both the Imperium's military strength and its symbolic heart. Mortarian, Primarch of the Death Guard and now Demon Prince of Nurgle, led his pestilent legions into the 500 worlds with methodical precision. Unlike the Berserker assaults favored by some Chaos forces, the Death Guard advanced with grim patience, contaminating world after world with carefully engineered plagues that weakened resistance before their troops even made planetfall. Ixax, once known as Garden of Ultramar for its breathtaking natural beauty and agricultural productivity, became the first major casualty of Mortarian's campaign. Death Guard plague ships seeded the upper atmosphere with spore pods containing modified strains of Nurgle's rot, a warp-empowered contagion that transformed its victims into mindless, shambling plague zombies. Within weeks, the planet's major population centers had collapsed into anarchy as the disease spread faster than quarantine measures could contain it. The Ultramarines responded with disciplined fury. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar directed the evacuation of uninfected civilian populations, while Primaris Hellblaster squads established sterilization zones around critical infrastructure. The Primaris Marines' enhanced physiology provided greater resistance to the Death Guard's plagues, allowing them to operate in contaminated environments that would have quickly incapacitated their traditional counterparts. At Connor, another key system in Ultramar, the Death Guard employed different tactics. Rather than biological warfare, they utilized their allies among the forces of chaos to maximum effect. Renegade Knight houses provided heavy support for Death Guard infantry, their massive war machines stomping through Imperial defensive lines while protected by clouds of plague flies that obscured targeting systems and corroded exposed metal. Demon engines, including Blight Haulers and Plague Burst Crawlers, advanced alongside Mortarian's Plague Marines, creating a combined arms assault of terrifying effectiveness. The defense of the Connor system became a desperate holding action. Imperial forces concentrated on protecting manufacturing centers and spaceports, conceding less critical territories to the advancing Death Guard. Primaris aggressors proved particularly effective in the urban combat that characterized much of the campaign, their Fragstorm grenade launchers clearing contaminated buildings, while their Flamestorm gauntlets provided cleansing fire that could purge even Nurgle's resilient servants. The tide of the Plague Wars shifted dramatically with Guilliman's arrival. The Primarch, having crossed back through the Nachman Gauntlet with a substantial portion of Fleet Primus, brought not just military reinforcement, but strategic genius that had been absent from the Imperial defense. Guilliman immediately recognized Mortarian's overall strategy. The Death Guard were not simply raiding, but implementing a systematic campaign to transform the 500 worlds into a mirror of their own plague-ridden territories in the warp. The counteroffensive began at Parmenio, where Death Guard forces had established a major foothold. Guilliman personally led a spearhead assault against the planet's primary hive city, now transformed into a festering breeding ground for new plagues. The Victrix Guard, Guilliman's personal Primaris honor guard, carved a path through Plague Marines and Poxwalkers alike, their master-crafted power swords cleaving through corrupted flesh with terrible efficiency. The confrontation that Imperial historians would later call the Battle of the Two Primarchs occurred in the ruins of Parmenio's governor's palace. Mortarian, his once noble form now a bloated mockery of his former self, descended from the skis on rotting wings to confront his loyal brother. The duel that followed tested even Guilliman's transhuman capabilities to their limit. Mortarian's scythe's silence, dripping with toxins that could kill a space marine with the slightest scratch, swept in great arcs that Guilliman parried with the Emperor's sword, its purifying flames causing the demon Primarch visible pain where they touched his corrupted flesh. Their battle remained inconclusive, interrupted when a massive void shield collapse triggered by Death Guard saboteurs forced both Primarchs to withdraw their forces. Nevertheless, the symbolic impact of Guilliman's personal intervention galvanized Imperial resistance throughout Ultramar. Planets that had been on the verge of surrender found new resolve, while Space Marine chapters with traditional ties to the Ultramarines dispatched reinforcements from across the segmentum. The war for Ultramar continued for nearly 7 years, with territories changing hands multiple times as the advantage shifted between the opposing forces. The Death Guard's resilience made them nearly impossible to dislodge once they had established a foothold, while the Ultramarines' superior tactical flexibility allowed them to exploit weaknesses in enemy deployments. The conflict eventually reached a stalemate, with Mortarion withdrawing the bulk of his forces after Guilliman successfully implemented a new defensive strategy that incorporated both traditional and Primaris Marines in complementary roles. The Plague Wars, while consuming significant Imperial resources, also provided valuable experience in combating the forces of Nurgle, knowledge that would prove crucial in later campaigns. The Ultramarines and their successors developed new protocols for operating in biologically contaminated environments, while Adeptus Mechanicus Biologus specialists studied captured plague samples to create more effective treatments and prophylactic measures. As the situation in Ultramar stabilized, a new threat emerged at the opposite end of the Nachmund gauntlet. The Vigilus system, anchoring the Imperium Sanctus side of this vital passage, came under attack from multiple enemies simultaneously. Genestealer cult uprisings, dormant for generations, erupted across the planet's major hive cities, while Orc forces launched opportunistic raids against weakened Imperial positions. Most concerning, however, was the arrival of Harkon Worldclimber, herald of the apocalypse and chosen champion of Abaddon the Despoiler. Harkon's arrival on Vigilus was preceded by a massive warp storm that disrupted orbital defenses and communications. The Chaos Lord made planetfall with a personal retinue of Raptor cult members, their jump packs leaving contrails of brimstone as they descended upon the governmental district of Hyperia Hive. Standing atop the ruins of the planetary governor's palace, Harkon planted his Hellspear, a warp-touched artifact of terrible power, and made a chilling proclamation. Vigilus would fall to chaos within 80 days, becoming the first conquest in Abaddon's new campaign. The defense of Vigilus fell to Marneus Calgar, dispatched by Guilliman to secure this crucial strategic location. The chapter master immediately recognized that conventional defensive approaches would be insufficient against the multifaceted threat facing the planet. Instead, he implemented what Imperial tacticians would later call the Vigilus pattern defense, a flexible response that allocated forces based on threat assessment rather than territorial control. Primaris Vanguard units were deployed against Genestealer cult uprisings, their enhanced sensor suites allowing them to identify infected individuals even when they appeared outwardly human. Invictor tactical warsuits proved particularly effective in the confined spaces of Vigilus's underhives, their incendium cannons purging Xenos infestations with cleansing promethium, while their reinforced frontal armor withstood the mining explosives favored by cult forces. Against the Orc threat, Calgar deployed more conventional forces. Astra Militarum tank companies established defensive perimeters around critical infrastructure, while Tempestus Scions conducted targeted raids against Orc leadership. Space Marine Devastator squads occupied key vantage points, their heavy weapons providing overlapping fields of fire that could decimate Orc mobs as they charged Imperial positions. The most elite forces were reserved for operations against Harkon's Chaos forces. Terminator armored veterans of the Ultramarines' First Company, supported by Primaris aggressors, engaged Chaos Space Marines in the brutal close quarters fighting that characterized urban warfare on Vigilus. Librarians from several chapters combined their psychic abilities to counter the warp sorcery employed by Harkon's followers, creating zones of relative stability where Imperial forces could operate without fear of demonic manifestation. The conflict reached its climax when Harkon personally led an assault on the Hyperia force field generators, massive installations that protected the Hive city from the toxic atmosphere of Vigilus. Calgar, anticipating this move, had prepared a trap. As Harkon's forces breached the generator complex's outer defenses, they triggered a series of teleport homers that had been concealed throughout the facility. Ultramarines Terminators materialized in the midst of the Chaos formation, their storm bolters and power fists reaping a terrible toll among the unprepared traitors. Harkon himself faced Calgar in single combat amid the sparking machinery of the main generator chamber. The Chaos Lord's Hellspear clashed against Calgar's gauntlets of Ultramar, warp energy crackling where the weapons met. Though grievously wounded in the exchange, Calgar managed to land a decisive blow that shattered Harkon's jump pack and sent him plummeting into the generator's plasma containment field. The Herald of the Apocalypse did not die. His warp-touched nature allowed him to escape through the Imperium, but his defeat represented a significant Imperial victory and a repudiation of his 80-day prophecy. The War of Beasts on Vigilus continued despite Harkon's defeat, with Abaddon himself eventually arriving to take personal command of Chaos forces. The conflict would consume Imperial resources for years, its strategic importance ensuring that neither side could afford to concede. Nevertheless, the initial defense against Harkon's assault had bought crucial time, allowing reinforcements to reach Vigilus and establishing defensive positions that would prove difficult for even the despoiler to overcome. While these major campaigns consumed much of the Indomitus Crusade's attention, equally important work was being done along the edges of Imperial space. The Sentinel Worlds, a designation given to planets situated at strategic locations along the borders of the Imperium, had suffered disproportionately during the upheavals following the Great Rift's formation. Many had been isolated for years, their defenders fighting desperate holding actions against enemies emboldened by the Imperium's apparent collapse. The reclamation of these worlds became a priority for specialized Crusade battle groups. These operations rarely involved the massive forces deployed at Ultramar or Vigilus, instead utilizing precision strikes by small but elite formations. Primaris Vanguard Marines proved particularly valuable in these campaigns, their emphasis on stealth and reconnaissance allowing Imperial commanders to maximize the impact of limited resources. Kaelax Bane, a Sentinel world guarding a stable warp route into the Segmentum Pacificus, exemplified the challenges and opportunities presented by these operations. The planet had endured a 3-year siege by Dark Eldar raiders, its population reduced to hiding in shielded bunkers while Xeno's slavers prowled the surface. The Imperial Relief Force, comprising elements from the White Scars and their Primaris successors, the Storm Riders, utilized the hit-and-run tactics favored by both chapters to devastating effect. Rather than engaging the numerically superior Dark Eldar directly, White Scars bike squads conducted high-speed strikes against raiding parties, while Primaris suppressors provided covering fire from concealed positions. This approach frustrated the Dark Eldar's preferred combat style, denying them the quick, decisive engagements they favored. As the Xenos forces spread out to counter the Space Marines' mobile warfare, they exposed themselves to precisely the sort of ambushes the White Scars had been setting up. The liberation of Kaelax Bane restored a crucial defensive position to Imperial control, while demonstrating the effectiveness of combining traditional and Primaris Space Marines in complementary roles. Similar operations throughout the Galactic Rim gradually re-established the network of Sentinel worlds that had traditionally formed the Imperium's first line of defense against external threats. These worlds took on even greater importance in the post-Rift era, as many traditional defensive systems had been disrupted by the Great Rift's formation. Astropathic relay stations were established on reclaimed Sentinel worlds, creating a communication network that partially compensated for the unreliability of long-range astropathic messages. These stations, typically protected by substantial ground-based defenses and at least one Space Marine strike cruiser, allowed Imperial forces to coordinate responses to emerging threats despite the communication difficulties created by the Great Rift. The defensive value of these installations was demonstrated during the Third Tyranid incursion at Lochavar Septum. a splinter fleet from Hive Fleet Leviathan, approaching from galactic south, was detected by Auspex arrays on 3 separate Sentinel worlds before it reached inhabited Imperial space. This early warning allowed for the deployment of a substantial naval force that intercepted the Tyranid bioships at the edge of the Lokivar system, preventing them from establishing the foothold they would need for a full-scale invasion. The battle against Hive Fleet Leviathan demonstrated the evolution of Imperial anti-Tyranid tactics in the post-Primaris era. Repulsor-class tanks, their grav plates allowing for unprecedented mobility on broken terrain, proved highly effective against Tyranid ground forces accustomed to facing more conventional Imperial armor. Primaris Hellblasters, deployed in overlapping fire teams, created killing zones that even the largest Tyranid bioforms struggled to cross, their plasma incinerators reducing chitinous armor to molten slag. Most significant was the deployment of Primaris suppressors against Tyranid synapse creatures. These specialized heavy support troops, equipped with accelerator auto-cannons capable of sustained fire at exceptional range, could target and eliminate Hive tyrants and other synapse nodes while remaining beyond the reach of most Tyranid weapons. Without synapse control, the lesser Tyranid organisms reverted to instinctual behavior, making them vulnerable to conventional military countermeasures. The containment of Hive Fleet Leviathan represented a significant achievement, but the Tyranids remained a persistent threat along the eastern fringe of the galaxy. Imperial strategists recognized that these encounters were likely only splinter fleets, vanguard elements of much larger Tyranid formations still approaching from intergalactic space. The reclaimed Sentinel worlds would serve as an early warning system for these future invasions, their enhanced monitoring capabilities representing one of the few advantages the Imperium held against this implacable enemy. While the Tyranids presented an existential threat to all life in the galaxy, the Orcs remained the most persistent day-to-day adversaries faced by Imperial forces. The upheavals following the Great Rift's formation had created ideal conditions for Orc expansion, with many Imperial worlds left defenseless as their protectors responded to more immediate chaos incursions. By the time the Indomitus Crusade reached the Ultima Segmentum, several major Orc empires had established themselves in formerly Imperial territory. Most concerning was the WAAGH, led by Gozkul Thraka, now self-proclaimed prophet of Gork and Mork, and arguably the most dangerous Orc warlord in the galaxy. Having been driven from Armageddon by Imperial forces years earlier, Gozkul had consolidated his power in the Golgotha sector, uniting dozens of previously competing Orc clans under his leadership. Intelligence reports indicated he was gathering a fleet of unprecedented size, though its ultimate destination remained unknown. The Indomitus Crusade, like all great military endeavors throughout human history, was shaped as much by the individuals who led it as by the strategies they employed. At its heart stood Roboute Guilliman, the Avenging Sun, whose tactical brilliance and administrative genius provided the foundation upon which the entire enterprise rested. Guilliman approached the Crusade with the methodical precision that had always characterized his leadership. Each morning cycle aboard the Macrag's honor began with strategic assessment meetings, where the Primarch reviewed intelligence from dozens of war zones simultaneously. His transhuman mind processed information at a rate that left even veteran officers struggling to keep pace. Battle reports, logistical analyses, and astropathic communications were absorbed and synthesized into comprehensive strategic directives that accounted for variables most Imperial commanders would never have considered. The Primarch's personal combat style reflected this same calculated approach. When circumstances required his direct intervention on the battlefield, Guilliman fought with controlled precision rather than berserker fury. The Hand of Dominion, his massive power fist, delivered crushing blows with surgical accuracy, while the Emperor's sword burned with purifying flame that proved particularly devastating against warp-tainted enemies. His armor, the Armor of Fate, incorporated technologies from both the Dark Age and Belisarius Call's more recent innovations, providing protection that allowed the Primarch to wade through enemy fire that would have annihilated even Terminator-armored Space Marines. Perhaps Guilliman's greatest contribution to the Crusade, however, was his ability to adapt ancient strategic principles to the unprecedented challenges of the 41st millennium. The Codex Imperialis, which guided all Crusade operations, demonstrated this adaptive genius. Where the original Codex Astartes had been prescriptive, the Codex Imperialis emphasized flexibility and local initiative. Guilliman recognized that in an era where communications could be disrupted for months or years by warp storms, field commanders needed the authority and conceptual framework to make independent decisions aligned with broader strategic goals. This emphasis on adaptability extended to Guilliman's personal leadership style. Veterans of the Great Crusade who had known the Primarch before his wounding noted subtle but significant changes in his approach. Where once he had maintained a certain emotional distance from his subordinates, the reborn Guilliman displayed greater empathy and psychological insight. He seemed to understand instinctively which officers responded best to encouragement and which required stern direction, tailoring his interactions accordingly. This evolution in Guilliman's character manifested most clearly in his relationships with the Primaris Marines. Recognizing that these warriors, despite their enhanced capabilities, struggled with questions of identity and purpose, the Primarch made a point of personally addressing Primaris formations before major engagements. These speeches, recorded and preserved by chapter remembrancers, balanced practical tactical guidance with deeper reflections on the nature of duty and sacrifice in an age of unprecedented darkness. Working in close concert with Guilliman was Belisarius Cawl, whose technological innovations formed the material backbone of the Crusade. The ancient Archmagos had changed dramatically in the centuries since beginning work on the Primaris project. His physical form had been extensively modified, with only small portions of his original biological components remaining. Mechadendrites of varying sizes and functions extended from his central mass, allowing him to interact with multiple projects simultaneously. His consciousness itself had expanded beyond normal parameters, distributed across multiple data cores that allowed him to process information at rates that approached artificial intelligence without technically crossing the lines forbidden by Mechanicus doctrine. Cawl's contributions extended far beyond the creation of the Primaris Marines themselves. Throughout the Crusade, he continued to refine and expand upon his original designs, developing new variants of Primaris armor and weaponry tailored to specific tactical requirements. The Gravis pattern armor worn by aggressor squads represented one such innovation, its enhanced power systems and reinforced plating providing protection comparable to Terminator armor while maintaining greater mobility. The Archmagos maintained research facilities aboard his personal vessel, the Tsar Quicitor, where captured Xenotech and recovered Archaeotech underwent extensive analysis. These studies led to practical battlefield applications that provided crucial advantages in specific engagements. When Tyranid forces deployed previously unseen bioorganisms during the defense of Lochavar Septum, it was Cawl's hastily developed countermeasures that allowed Imperial forces to neutralize these new threats before they could overwhelm defensive positions. Cawl's methods often pushed the boundaries of what the more conservative elements of the Adeptus Mechanicus considered acceptable. His willingness to incorporate principles derived from Xenotech study into ostensibly compliant designs created ongoing tension with Mars. The Fabricator General dispatched multiple delegations throughout the Crusade to monitor Cawl's activities, though these observers frequently found themselves assigned to peripheral research teams with limited access to the Archmagos' most sensitive work. Guilliman tolerated these heterodox approaches because they produced results. The Primarch maintained a pragmatic view of technology that prioritized effectiveness over doctrinal purity, an attitude that aligned with Cawl's own functional approach. This alliance of convenience between the Primarch and the Archmagos occasionally created political complications, particularly when dealing with Forge worlds recently liberated from chaos occupation, but the tactical advantages it provided were deemed worth the diplomatic challenges. Among the chapter masters who distinguished themselves during the Crusade, Marnius Calgar of the Ultramarines occupied a unique position. As Guilliman's gene son and the leader of his chapter for centuries before the Primarch's return, Calgar initially struggled to define his role in the new hierarchy. The defense of Vigilis provided him with the opportunity to demonstrate that his experience and tactical acumen remained valuable even in the Primarch's shadow. Calgar's leadership during the War of Beasts exemplified the complementary relationship that developed between traditional Astartes commanders and the returning Primarch. Where Guilliman focused on grand strategy across multiple sectors, Calgar excelled at operational-level planning that translated these broader directives into specific deployment patterns and engagement protocols. His intimate knowledge of the Ultramarines and their successor chapters allowed him to leverage their individual strengths in ways that maximized their effectiveness within Guilliman's overall strategic framework. The chapter master's decision to undergo the Rubicon Primaris, the dangerous surgical procedure that transformed traditional Space Marines into Primaris, represented both practical necessity and symbolic significance. Physically, the transformation enhanced Calgar's combat capabilities, allowing him to better withstand the increasingly dangerous enemies faced by Imperial forces. Symbolically, it demonstrated to traditional Astartes throughout the Imperium that embracing the Primaris evolution did not require abandoning their established identities and traditions. Calgar's post-transformation combat record justified the risk he had taken. During the Third Battle of Hyperia Hive on Vigilis, the chapter master faced a Chaos Decimator demon engine that had broken through Imperial lines and threatened a critical command center. Witnesses reported that Calgar engaged the massive war machine directly, the enhanced strength provided by his Primaris physiology, allowing him to tear off one of its weapon arms before destroying its core with precision strikes from his gauntlets of Ultramar. Such feats would have been beyond his capabilities before crossing the Rubicon. Other chapter masters made similarly significant contributions to the Crusade's success. Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves, initially skeptical of the Primaris reinforcements, eventually integrated them into his great companies in unique ways that preserved Fenrisian culture while leveraging their enhanced capabilities. During the liberation of the Donnar system, Grimnar led a mixed force of traditional Wolfguard and Primaris aggressors in a boarding action against a Death Guard-plagued ship. The operation demonstrated how the two types of Astartes could complement each other, with the Wolfguard's experience and savagery paired with the aggressor's durability and sustained firepower. Azrael of the Dark Angels approached the integration of Primaris Marines with characteristic caution. The Supreme Grand Master maintained strict separation between Primaris reinforcements and the inner circle that guarded the chapter's deepest secrets, a policy that created tension but reflected the Dark Angels' paranoid approach to security. Despite these restrictions, Azrael deployed Primaris units effectively during the Crusade, particularly in actions against fallen angels, where their lack of knowledge about the chapter's hidden shame proved advantageous rather than limiting. The Crusade also saw the rise of entirely new heroes, particularly among the Primaris chapters created during the Ultima founding. Chapter Master Asterion Malak of the Minotaurs, long a controversial figure for his chapter's role as enforcers for the High Lords of Terra, demonstrated remarkable battlefield prowess during engagements against Chaos forces in the Eridani sector. His personal combat with Lucius the Eternal, champion of Slaanesh, ended inconclusively when warp disturbances forced both forces to withdraw, but Malak's ability to match the ancient swordsman stroke for stroke earned grudging respect even from chapters traditionally hostile to the Minotaurs. Among the newly elevated Primaris chapter masters, Felix Novist of the Dawn Breakers quickly established himself as both a tactical innovator and inspirational leader. The Dawn Breakers specialized in operations on worlds affected by perpetual darkness, whether natural or warp-induced. Novist developed the Light-Bearer doctrine that utilized Primaris inceptors equipped with specialized illumination ammunition to create temporary zones of visibility within which more conventional forces could operate effectively. This approach proved particularly useful against Night Lord's forces in the Noctis sector, where centuries-old patterns of ambush and terror tactics were disrupted by the Dawnbreakers' ability to deny the traitors their preferred shadowed environments. The role of the Adeptus Custodes in the Crusade deserved special recognition, particularly Shield Captain Heraclast Vadrian, who commanded the contingent assigned to Fleet Primus. Vadrian's golden armor, inscribed with oaths of moment dating back to the Wars of Unification, marked him as one of the Emperor's most ancient servants. His combat record during the Crusade added new honors to this storied history, particularly his actions during the Battle of Sangua Gate, where he personally eliminated 3 Chaos Lords in rapid succession during boarding actions against enemy vessels. Vadrian's most significant contribution, however, came through his leadership of the Torchbearers Initiative. Recognizing that many Space Marine chapters in Imperium Nihilus faced extinction without reinforcement, the Shield Captain developed protocols for rapidly assessing chapter needs and deploying appropriate resources. His detailed understanding of the Primaris creation process, gained through direct observation of Call's work on Mars, allowed him to troubleshoot implementation issues that might otherwise have prevented successful adoption of the technology by isolated chapters. The Sisters of Silence played an equally crucial role in the Crusade, though their contributions often went unrecorded due to their vow of absolute silence. Oblivion Knight Trig Vash, who led the Silent Sisterhood contingent attached to Fleet Primus, developed new tactics for deploying Null Maidens against the demonic entities that poured through the Great Rift in unprecedented numbers. The Null Sphere formation, which positioned Sisters of Silence in concentric rings around Primaris assault units, created zones where warp entities found their powers significantly diminished, allowing even conventional weapons to wound and banish them. The most dramatic demonstration of this tactic came during the liberation of Ophelia 7, where a greater demon of Tzeentch had established a reality-warping domain within the planet's primary cathedral complex. Conventional forces had proven ineffective against the constantly shifting architecture and physics-defying defenses created by the demon's presence. Vash led a force of 40 Sisters of Silence in a direct assault on the cathedral, their null auras temporarily stabilizing reality around them and creating a pathway through which Guilliman himself could reach and engage the greater demon. Among the Primaris Marines themselves, certain individuals achieved recognition that elevated them above their already exceptional brethren. Captain Decimus Felix, appointed by Guilliman as equerry and battlefield commander of the Unnumbered Suns, demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility throughout the Crusade. Originally created from Ultramarines gene seed, Felix incorporated elements from multiple chapter combat doctrines into his approach, adapting his tactics to specific battlefield conditions rather than adhering rigidly to any single tradition. Felix's finest hour came during the invasion of Rhokkos, where he commanded a mixed force of Primaris Marines drawn from different gene lines in a series of precision strikes against Chaos Command assets. Rather than attempting to homogenize their approaches, Felix leveraged the distinct combat tendencies associated with each Primarch's legacy. Blood Angels-derived units were assigned shock assault objectives that benefited from their aggressive tendencies, while Raven Guard successors conducted parallel infiltration operations that exploited their natural affinity for stealth. As the Indomitus Crusade progressed, the relationship between these heroes evolved from professional cooperation to something approaching genuine brotherhood. The shared experiences of desperate battles against overwhelming odds created bonds that transcended the political and doctrinal differences that might otherwise have divided them. Veterans of key engagements like the Battle of Rhokkos or the Plague Wars developed a shorthand communication that allowed for more efficient coordination in subsequent operations, with subtle references to previous battles conveying complex tactical concepts without the need for lengthy explanations. This sense of shared purpose became particularly important as the Crusade pushed into Imperium Nihilus, where isolated Imperial forces had developed divergent approaches based on local conditions and limited resources. The arrival of Crusade forces led by commanders with direct connections to Terra helped reintegrate these scattered defenders into the broader Imperial military structure, without completely overriding the adaptive strategies they had developed during their isolation. As the Indomitus Crusade carved its path through the fractured Imperium, its greatest opposition came not from disorganization or logistical challenges, but from the determined resistance of enemies who recognized the existential threat that Guilliman's campaign represented. Chief among these foes stood Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos and architect of the Black Crusades that had plagued the Imperium for 10 millennia. From his command fortress aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Abaddon monitored the progress of the Indomitus Crusade with cold calculation. The Despoiler had not spent millennia planning the fall of Cadia and the creation of the Great Rift merely to watch a returned Primarch undo his work. Intelligence reports from cultist networks and corrupted Imperial officials provided him with detailed assessments of Crusade fleet movements and force compositions. This information allowed Abaddon to develop counter-strategies specifically tailored to exploit weaknesses in Guilliman's campaign plan. The Black Legion's primary approach involved what Imperial strategists termed strategic denial, rather than attempting to hold territory against the overwhelming might of Crusade battle groups. Abaddon's forces would strike at supply lines, staging areas, and recently liberated worlds. These attacks forced Guilliman to divert resources to defensive operations, slowing the Crusade's momentum and preventing the concentration of forces necessary for major offensives. Typical of this approach was the Black Legion's campaign in the Machorda Sound, a region of space adjacent to the Nachman Gauntlet. While Guilliman focused on securing this vital passage through the Great Rift, Abaddon dispatched a fleet under the command of the Chaos Lord Urcanthos to raid Imperial shipping in nearby sectors. These attacks targeted munitions convoys and Prometheum tankers bound for frontline Crusade forces, creating critical shortages that delayed planned offensives by weeks or even months. When Imperial naval assets moved to counter these raids, they found themselves drawn into carefully prepared traps. Black Legion vessels would feign retreat, luring pursuers into minefields composed of warp-tainted explosives that corrupted Gellar fields on detonation. Ships that survived these initial ambushes often faced boarding actions by Terminator-armored veterans of the Long War, who teleported directly onto command decks and engineering sections. The loss of multiple escort carriers in the Machorda Sound forced a significant redeployment of Crusade fleet elements, reducing naval support available for operations elsewhere. On worlds already liberated by the Crusade, the Black Legion employed more subtle methods. Cultist cells, established decades or even centuries before the Great Rift's formation, activated to conduct sabotage operations against critical infrastructure. Manufacturing facilities producing ammunition for Primaris bolt weapons suffered industrial accidents that reduced output by significant margins. Water purification systems on hive worlds were contaminated with compounds that, while not immediately lethal, caused neurological damage that increased susceptibility to chaos corruption. Most insidious were the psychological operations directed at civilian populations on reclaimed worlds. Black Legion agents spread rumors that the returned Primarch was not Guilliman at all, but a warp entity masquerading as the Avenging Sun to lead the Imperium to destruction. These whisper campaigns were reinforced by targeted assassinations of Imperial officials who most vocally supported the Crusade, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that undermined civil governance and complicated pacification efforts. Abaddon's strategic genius showed most clearly in his management of allied chaos forces. Rather than attempting to directly control the notoriously independent warbands and renegade factions, the Despoiler provided them with intelligence about vulnerable targets and occasionally supplied specialized equipment for specific operations. This light-touch approach maximized the disruptive impact of these forces while allowing the Black Legion to maintain its focus on critical strategic objectives. When direct confrontation became necessary, Abaddon deployed his forces with precision rather than overwhelming numbers. The Vengeful Spirit itself appeared at only 3 major engagements during the entire Indomitus Crusade, each time striking at locations where Guilliman was confirmed to be absent. These carefully timed appearances allowed the Despoiler to achieve local superiority against isolated Crusade elements without risking a direct confrontation with the Primarch that might have proven decisive. While Abaddon worked to contain the Crusade through strategic disruption, Mortarion and his Death Guard pursued a different approach entirely. The Demon Primarch's Plague Wars in Ultramarines represented not just a military campaign, but a fundamental attack on the ideological heart of Guilliman's vision for the Imperium. By corrupting the 500 worlds, long held as an exemplar of imperial governance and efficiency, Mortarion sought to demonstrate that even the Avenging Sun's most cherished creation could fall to Nurgle's embrace. The Death Guard's biological warfare capabilities had evolved significantly since the days of the Horus Heresy. Where once they had relied primarily on conventional toxins and viral agents, 10,000 years of existence in Nurgle's domain had provided them with plagues that defied conventional medical understanding. The Destroyer Plague, deployed against major population centers on Parmenio, rewrote its victims' genetic code to transform them into living incubators for new disease strains. The Weeping Pox, used extensively throughout the Connor system, caused infected individuals to exude corrosive fluids that damaged infrastructure and equipment, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of decay. Mortarion's forces displayed remarkable patience in their operations. Unlike other Chaos factions that often sought immediate gratification through slaughter and destruction, the Death Guard were willing to invest in long-term corruption. On Ix, Death Guard sorcerers established ritual sites that gradually altered the planet's ecosystem, transforming once productive agricultural regions into festering swamps ideal for breeding new plague vectors. These changes occurred slowly enough that imperial authorities often failed to recognize the pattern until corruption had become irreversible. The tactical doctrine employed by Death Guard forces emphasized attritional warfare that played to their unique strengths. Plague Marines, their bodies rendered nearly impervious to pain or fatigue by Nurgle's blessings, would establish defensive positions and simply hold them against all opposition, absorbing punishing amounts of firepower without breaking. When Imperial forces exhausted themselves against these positions, Blightlord Terminators would counterattack, their corroded but still functional teleport homers allowing them to materialize directly within enemy formations. Mortarion himself directed operations from his plague ship Endurance, descending to planetary surfaces only for critical engagements or significant ritual workings. The Demon Primarch's presence on a battlefield invariably shifted the balance of power, as reality itself warped around his corrupted form. Plants withered, metal corroded, and even the air became toxic within his vicinity. Against such power, even Primaris Marines found themselves at a severe disadvantage, their enhanced physiology providing only limited protection against warp-infused contagions. The most dangerous aspect of the Death Guard's campaign was its self-sustaining nature. Each world that fell to Nurgle's corruption became a breeding ground for new plagues and a source of reinforcements, as fallen Imperial citizens were transformed into poxwalkers that could be directed against neighboring systems. This exponential growth potential meant that even temporary Death Guard victories could have permanent strategic consequences if not promptly contained and cleansed. While Chaos forces represented the most direct opposition to the Indomitus Crusade, opportunistic Xenos incursions presented a different but equally significant challenge. The Drukhari, in particular, recognized the strategic opportunity presented by the Imperium's divided attention. Raiding parties from Komorog increased in both frequency and scale, targeting vulnerable worlds along the edges of Crusade advance corridors. Archon Kaisajuras of the Poisoned Tongue Cabal specialized in attacking worlds recently liberated by Crusade forces. His methodology demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Imperial military doctrine. Kaisajuras would wait until primary Crusade elements had moved on to their next objectives, leaving behind smaller garrison forces, typically composed of Astra Militarum regiments supported by limited Astartes detachments. These forces, often exhausted from the initial liberation battles and stretched thin across multiple population centers, proved vulnerable to the Drukhari's lightning-fast raids. The Poisoned Tongue's attacks focused on capturing slaves rather than holding territory. Homunculi accompanying these raids would assess captives for specific genetic traits or psychic potential, selecting those most valuable for the flesh markets of Commorragh. These highly targeted abductions often removed key technical personnel or leadership figures, significantly hampering recovery efforts on affected worlds. In several documented cases, entire Mechanicus research teams disappeared during Drukhari raids, setting back technological restoration projects by years. Imperial responses to these raids were complicated by the Drukhari's superior mobility. Webway portals, often hidden in abandoned structures or natural formations, allowed raiding parties to appear without warning and withdraw before significant forces could be mobilized against them. Attempts to track these raiders back to their entry points typically failed, as the Drukhari employed specialized chrono devices that collapsed temporary webway passages behind them. The most effective countermeasures came from Primaris Vanguard forces, whose enhanced sensor capabilities and emphasis on rapid response made them well-suited to anti-Drukhari operations. Incursor squads, in particular, demonstrated an ability to predict likely raid targets through analysis of population movements and resource concentrations. By positioning themselves at these locations before attacks occurred, they could ambush the would-be ambushers, turning the Drukhari's surprise tactics against them. Orc expansions represented a more straightforward, but no less dangerous threat to Crusade operations. The disruption caused by the Great Rift had weakened Imperial defenses along traditional containment corridors, allowing several major WAAGs to break out into previously secure space. Unlike the Drukhari, whose raids were precisely targeted and limited in scope, Orc invasions represented a potentially existential threat to entire sectors if allowed to gain momentum. The Charadan sector faced the most significant Orc threat, as Warlord Gruckface Ripa united multiple tribes into a cohesive force that overwhelmed Imperial defenses on over a dozen worlds. Gruck's forces displayed unusual tactical sophistication, focusing their initial attacks on communications, arrays, and defense installations rather than population centers. This approach, uncharacteristic of typical Orc behavior, suggested the influence of the beast Snagas, a recently emerged Orc subculture that emphasized cunning over brute force. The Orc advance through Charadan created particular challenges for Crusade planners. Unlike Chaos forces, which could be temporarily contained through warp-based countermeasures, or Drukhari, whose raids remained limited in scope, Orc infestations represented a permanently escalating threat. Each world that fell provided the Greenskins with additional resources and recruits, accelerating their expansion in a self-reinforcing cycle that became increasingly difficult to contain. Imperial response to the Charadan situation demonstrated the flexibility of Guilliman's strategic doctrine. Rather than diverting major Crusade battle groups from their primary objectives, the Primarch authorized the creation of specialized task forces composed of elements particularly effective against Orc physiology and tactics. Primaris Hellblasters, whose plasma incinerators could penetrate even the thickest Orc armor, formed the core of these forces. They were supported by Astra Militarum artillery regiments equipped with Basilisk Earthshakers, whose high-explosive shells proved devastatingly effective against the tightly packed Orc hordes. While these conventional threats commanded the majority of Crusade resources, the silent spread of Genestealer cults represented a more insidious danger. These Xenos infiltration organisms had established themselves on thousands of Imperial worlds before the Great Rift's formation, their patient subversion continuing undetected as Imperial attention focused on more obvious threats. The disruption caused by the Crusade's passage through infected systems often triggered premature cult uprisings, as patriarchs sensed opportunity in the temporary disorder that accompanied regime change. On Vigilis, where Genestealer cult activity had already been identified before the Crusade's arrival, Marneus Calgar implemented containment protocols that would become standard throughout Crusade operations. Primaris Vanguard units with enhanced bioscanners conducted systematic sweeps of population centers, identifying infected individuals through subtle physiological markers invisible to conventional medical screening. Chaplains and librarians worked with local ecclesiarchy representatives, to develop modified religious observances that would reveal cult members through their inability to properly participate in emperor worship. The most comprehensive anti-cult operations occurred on Larakas too, where intelligence suggested a fourth-generation infestation had compromised approximately 30% of the planet's population. Rather than attempting conventional military operations against an enemy that had thoroughly embedded itself within civilian communities, Inquisitor Greyfax authorized a multi-phase containment approach. The planet's major cities were sequentially isolated, with all transportation between population centers temporarily suspended under the pretext of warp storm activity. Each isolated zone was then subjected to intensive screening, with confirmed human citizens relocated to secure facilities while infected areas were systematically purged. These operations, while effective, consumed enormous resources and created significant civil disruption that impacted Crusade logistics. Worlds undergoing anti-cult purges typically experienced productivity drops of 40–60% during the active phase of operations, with recovery periods extending months or even years afterward. This economic impact created cascading supply problems that affected Crusade elements operating in adjacent sectors, demonstrating how even unseen enemies could indirectly hinder Guilliman's broader strategic objectives. The most concerning development for Imperial strategists was evidence suggesting coordination between these disparate threats. While historical enemies like orcs and tyrannids remained fundamentally opposed to each other, instances of apparent cooperation between Chaos forces and certain Xenos factions increased significantly during the Crusade period. Particularly troubling were documented cases where Genestealer cult uprisings coincided precisely with Black Legion fleet movements, suggesting information sharing, if not direct coordination. The Psychian Conclave, a gathering of senior inquisitors and librarians convened by Guilliman to assess these patterns, concluded that, while formal alliances between such radically different factions remained unlikely, the strategic pressure created by the Crusade had produced a form of convergent evolution in their tactics. Enemies that would normally have pursued independent agendas found themselves inadvertently supporting each other's operations, simply by targeting the same overstretched Imperial forces. This tactical convergence reached its apex during the Second Battle of Connor, where Imperial defenders faced simultaneous attacks from Death Guard-plagued ships in orbit, Genestealer cult uprisings in major population centers, and orc raiding parties striking at outlying agricultural zones. While no evidence suggested direct coordination between these forces, indeed, documented clashes occurred between orc and Genestealer elements in several locations. Their combined pressure nearly overwhelmed Imperial defenses before reinforcements from Fleet Tertius could arrive. The Tyrannid threat, while less immediately visible than these other challenges, represented perhaps the most fundamental danger to the Crusade's long-term objectives. Hive Fleet Leviathan, though temporarily fragmented by the psychic shock of the Great Rift's formation, had begun reconsolidating its strength along the eastern fringe of the galaxy. Splinter fleets probed Imperial defenses in dozens of sectors, testing for weaknesses while the main Hive fleet absorbed biomass from undefended worlds. The Indomitus Crusade had stretched across the fractured Imperium for over 12 standard years, reclaiming countless worlds and establishing beachheads in the darkness of Imperium Nihilus. As the campaign entered its final phase, Roboute Guilliman gathered his senior commanders aboard the Macrag's honor for what would become known as the Conclave of Rhokkos. The stratagem of the massive battleship had been configured to accommodate representatives from every major Imperial force that had participated in the Crusade. Chapter Masters of the Adeptus Astartes stood alongside Lord Admirals of the Imperial Navy, while Mechanicus Magi and Astra Militarum generals occupied stations appropriate to their rank. The data slates before each commander contained comprehensive assessments of the Crusade's accomplishments and the challenges that remained. By any objective measure, the campaign had achieved remarkable success. Over 3,000 worlds had been liberated from various enemies, secure warp routes had been established through the Nachmund Gauntlet and other stable passages in the Great Rift, and dozens of Space Marine chapters on the brink of extinction had been reinforced with Primaris Marines. Most significantly, the psychological impact of the Primarch's return and the successful prosecution of the Crusade had restored hope to an Imperium that had been teetering on the edge of collapse. Yet Guilliman, ever the pragmatist, recognized that the Crusade in its current form could not continue indefinitely. The logistical infrastructure required to support such a massive military undertaking was showing signs of strain, with Forge Worlds struggling to maintain production quotas and Tithe Worlds unable to supply sufficient manpower for ongoing operations. More concerning was the strategic situation developing in Ultramar, where Mortarian's forces continued to press their advantage in the Plague Wars, threatening the heart of Guilliman's traditional power base. The Indomitus Crusade has accomplished its primary objectives. Guilliman's formal declaration was recorded by servo skulls hovering near the chamber's vaulted ceiling. We have demonstrated that the Imperium retains the capacity and the will to strike back against its enemies. We have secured critical passages through the Great Rift and established sustainable defense perimeters around key Imperial worlds. Most importantly, we have provided the framework for continued reconquest through the distribution of Primaris technology and the founding of new chapters. The formal conclusion of the Crusade was marked by a ceremony on the planet Rokos, site of one of the campaign's most significant victories. Representatives from every Imperial organization that had participated in the Crusade gathered in a newly constructed Triumph Hall, built from the remnants of a Black Legion fortress. Guilliman, resplendent in his artificer armor, but notably without his helmet in a gesture of trust and openness, presented honors to units and individuals who had distinguished themselves during the campaign. The Blade Eternal, a relic power sword dating back to the Great Crusade, was presented to Chapter Master Felix Novist of the Dawn Breakers for his innovative tactics against Night Lord's forces. The Shield Indomitus, a master-crafted storm shield incorporating technology developed by Belisarius Call, went to Captain Dravis Corland of the Imperial Fists, who had held a critical defensive position during the Battle of Gathalammer, despite suffering wounds that would have killed a lesser Space Marine. Similar honors were bestowed upon representatives of the Imperial Navy, Astra Militarum, Adeptus Mechanicus, and even the Adeptus Administratum, whose logistical expertise had been essential to the Crusade's success. The conclusion of the Indomitus Crusade did not mark the end of Imperial offensive operations, but rather a transition to a more sustainable model of reconquest. The massive, unified force that had pushed outward from Terra was dissolved, with its components reassigned to more focused campaigns tailored to specific strategic objectives. This approach, which Imperial historians would later term the era Indomitus, maintained the momentum established by the Crusade while addressing the logistical challenges that had begun to hamper its effectiveness. Fleet Primus, under the command of Lord Admiral Spire, was tasked with securing and expanding the Nachmund Gauntlet, ensuring that this vital passage through the Great Rift remained under Imperial control. Fleet Secundus, led by Admiral Balthazar Hoyt, would focus on operations along the galactic south, where Tyrannid splinter fleets continued to probe Imperial defenses. Fleet Tertius received perhaps the most challenging assignment, supporting Imperial forces in Ultramar against Mortarian's Death Guard, a campaign that would eventually draw Guilliman himself back to his home realm. The administrative restructuring that accompanied this military reorganization demonstrated Guilliman's genius for governance as much as his tactical acumen. The Primarch recognized that the Imperium's Byzantine bureaucracy, which had accumulated layer upon layer of redundant offices and contradictory protocols over 10 millennia, represented as significant a threat to humanity's survival as any external enemy. The reforms he implemented, collectively known as the Lex Imperialis, represented the most comprehensive overhaul of imperial administration since the reformation of the Imperium following the Horus Heresy. At the heart of the Lex Imperialis stood the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the lowest competent level of authority, rather than automatically referred upward through multiple bureaucratic layers. Planetary governors received expanded authority to respond to local threats without waiting for sector-level approval, while sector governors gained the ability to redirect resources between systems based on strategic necessity rather than rigid tithe schedules. This decentralization of authority proved particularly valuable in Imperium Nihilus, where communication with Terra remained unreliable at best. To prevent this decentralization from leading to fragmentation or corruption, Guilliman established new oversight mechanisms that emphasized outcomes rather than procedural compliance. The Logos Historica Verita, a specialized division of the Adeptus Administratum, dispatched assessors to evaluate planetary and sector governance based on objective metrics like population stability, resource production, and military readiness. These assessors reported directly to a newly established Office of Imperial Verification, which had the authority to recommend remedial action against underperforming or corrupt officials. The implementation of these reforms faced significant resistance from entrenched interests within the imperial bureaucracy. The High Lords of Terra, accustomed to exercising near-absolute authority in the Emperor's name, viewed Guilliman's changes as threats to their traditional prerogatives. Several attempted to obstruct or undermine the Lex Imperialis through procedural maneuvers or outright sabotage of implementation efforts. The Primarch responded with characteristic directness, removing the most obstructionist High Lords and replacing them with individuals who recognized the existential necessity of reform. Fabricator General Cubic of Mars represented one of the most significant obstacles to Guilliman's reforms. The leader of the Adeptus Mechanicus viewed the Primarch's technological innovations, particularly those developed in collaboration with Belisarius Cawl, as potential threats to Mars's traditional monopoly on advanced technology. When Cubic attempted to restrict the distribution of Primaris creation technology to chapters operating beyond the Great Rift, Guilliman bypassed his authority entirely, establishing direct relationships between Cawl's research facilities and Forge Worlds that showed greater flexibility in their interpretation of Mechanicus doctrine. The ecclesiarchy presented different challenges. While the official imperial creed now recognized Guilliman as the Emperor's son returned, many conservative elements within the Church viewed his secular approach to governance with suspicion. The Primarch's refusal to acknowledge the Emperor's divinity created particular tension, as did his efforts to reduce the ecclesiarchy's influence over civil administration. These conflicts remained largely below the surface during the early implementation of the Lex Imperialis, but would emerge more prominently in later years as the initial crisis atmosphere faded. Perhaps the most innovative aspect of Guilliman's administrative reforms was the establishment of the Departamento Exacta, a specialized organization responsible for gathering and analyzing data from across the Imperium. Unlike traditional imperial information gathering bodies, which focused primarily on identifying threats or deviations from orthodoxy, the Departamento Exacta collected data on resource distribution, population trends, and industrial output. This information allowed for more effective allocation of imperial resources and early identification of systems at risk of economic collapse or social unrest. The technological backbone of these reforms came from Belisarius Cawl's laboratories. The ancient Archmagos developed specialized cogitator systems capable of processing the vast amounts of data generated by the Departamento Exacta, identifying patterns that would have been invisible to human analysts. These systems, carefully designed to avoid the prohibited realm of artificial intelligence, nevertheless represented significant advances over traditional imperial information technology. Their deployment to major administrative centers throughout Imperium Sanctus dramatically improved the speed and accuracy of imperial decision-making. The long-term strategic impact of the Indomitus Crusade extended far beyond the worlds it directly liberated. By demonstrating that the Imperium retained both the capacity and the will to project power across the galaxy, despite the catastrophic effects of the Great Rift, the Crusade fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of humanity's enemies. Chaos warbands that might have pushed deeper into Imperial territory instead consolidated their existing gains, wary of provoking a response from Guilliman's forces. Xeno's empires that had been expanding at the Imperium's expense reassessed their plans, recognizing that the easy victories of the immediate post-Rift period were no longer assured. This psychological impact proved particularly significant in Imperium Nihilus, where imperial authority had been most severely compromised by isolation from Terra. Worlds that might have surrendered to despair or sought accommodation with Xeno's powers instead found renewed determination to resist, knowing that reconnection with Imperium Sanctus remained a possibility. Even on planets where no Crusade forces had directly operated, the knowledge that Guilliman had successfully crossed the Great Rift and established beachheads in the Dark Imperium provided hope that had been notably absent during the Noctis Aeterna. The Space Marine chapters created during the Ultima founding represented one of the Crusade's most enduring legacies. These entirely Primaris formations, established at strategic locations throughout both Imperium Sanctus and Nihilus, provided stable centers of imperial authority around which other imperial organizations could rally. Their fortress monasteries served as defensive anchors that denied enemies easy access to surrounding systems, while their fleets maintained patrol routes that kept critical supply lines secure against raiders and pirates. Beyond their military significance, these new chapters often took on broader governance roles in regions where traditional imperial authority had collapsed. The Sons of the Phoenix, operating in the Ostacar sector, established a formal protectorate over 17 human worlds, whose sector government had been destroyed during the Noctis Aeterna. Chapter Master Drusus implemented a modified version of Ultramar's governance model, with each world assigned a Primaris lieutenant who served as both military commander and civil administrator. This arrangement, while technically exceeding traditional Astartes authority, received Guilliman's explicit approval as a necessary adaptation to the realities of the post-Rift Imperium. The technological advancements pioneered during the Crusade continued to spread throughout the Imperium after its formal conclusion. Call's innovations in weapons technology, power generation, and void ship propulsion were gradually disseminated to forge worlds deemed sufficiently trustworthy, improving Imperial military capabilities across multiple fronts. The repulsor chassis, initially developed for Primaris armored vehicles, was adapted for civilian applications including heavy cargo transport and emergency response vehicles. Even the enhanced Vox communication systems created for Primaris armor found their way into Astra Militarum command vehicles, improving battlefield coordination. Perhaps most significantly, the Primaris creation process itself continued to evolve. The initial procedure, which had been applied to the first generation of Primaris Marines while they were still in development, was refined into the Rubicon Primaris, a surgical protocol that could transform existing Space Marines into Primaris. Though initially carrying a significant mortality risk, continued improvements reduced this danger to acceptable levels, allowing increasing numbers of traditional Astartes to undergo the transformation. This development addressed one of the most significant potential sources of division within the Adeptus Astartes, as chapters that might have eventually become entirely Primaris through attrition instead maintained their cultural continuity through the transformation of their veterans. As the era Indomitus progressed, the Imperium remained beset by enemies on all sides. The Tyranid hive fleets continued their inexorable advance. Chaos forces launched new offensives from their strongholds within the Great Rift, and opportunistic Xeno's empires probed for weaknesses along the Imperium's borders. Yet the strategic situation had fundamentally changed from the desperate days following the Rift's formation. Where once the Imperium had faced the very real prospect of collapse, it now stood resilient, its military forces reorganized, its administrative structures streamlined, and its technological base enhanced. Guilliman harbored no illusions about the challenges that remained. In private communications with his most trusted advisors, the Primarch acknowledged that the Imperium remained in grave danger, with threats that could potentially overwhelm even his reformed military and administrative structures. Yet he also recognized that the Indomitus Crusade had accomplished its most essential objective. It had bought time. Time for the Imperium to adapt to the reality of the Great Rift. Time for new generations of leaders to emerge who understood the nature of the threats they faced. And time for humanity to marshal its still considerable resources for the endless war that lay ahead. In the grand stratagem of the Imperial Palace, where the Crusade had been planned more than a decade earlier, a new map of the Imperium now dominated the central display. Unlike the desperate assessment that had greeted Guilliman upon his return, this map showed an Imperium wounded but fighting back. Thousands of worlds that had glowed red with danger now shone with the steady blue of Imperial control. The Great Rift remained a jagged wound across the galaxy, but the passage points secured by the Crusade appeared as stable green corridors connecting the two halves of the Emperor's domain. It was not victory. Guilliman understood better than anyone that final victory might never be achieved in humanity's struggle against the darkness, but it was survival, and for now, that would have to be enough.